Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where the quietest stories are often the ones that stay with you the longest. There is something about the Arctic that does not let things go easily. You might expect it to. All that cold, all that pressure, all that darkness pressing down for months at a time. You might expect the Arctic to consume things, to swallow them cleanly and leave no trace. And often it does. But sometimes it does the opposite. Sometimes it holds on to something, turns it slowly in the ice, keeps it circling through the same grey waters for years and years, as if the landscape itself cannot quite decide what to do with it. As if something out there simply refuses to be finished. Tonight we are talking about a ship. Not a famous ship. Not a ship that carried explorers or made headlines when it launched. A working ship. A cargo vessel. The kind of ship that spent its life doing the quiet, unglamorous work of moving things from one cold place to another. And yet this ship became one of the strangest stories in the history of the sea. Not because of how it was lost, but because of how long it refused to stay lost. The SS Baychimo was abandoned in the Arctic in 1931. Its crew was evacuated. Its cargo was removed. It was left behind in the ice near Point Barrow, Alaska, and the people who knew it best assumed it would not survive the winter. It was a reasonable assumption. The Arctic is not a place that forgives neglect. And yet the Baychimo did not sink. It drifted. And it kept drifting. For 38 years, this crewless, engineless, rudderless ship moved through the waters of the Western Arctic, appearing and disappearing across hundreds of miles, spotted by hunters and trappers and pilots and sailors, boarding parties and passing aircraft, again and again across 4 decades. The last confirmed sighting was in 1969. After that, nothing. No wreck found, no definitive end, just a quiet disappearance into the same grey water it had been wandering through since the year before the Great Depression ended. 38 years. That is not a rounding error. That is not a ship that lingered for a season or two before going under. That is a ship that outlasted World War II, outlasted the Korean War, outlasted the entire first decade of the space age, all while drifting alone through one of the most hostile maritime environments on Earth, with no one at the wheel and no engine turning over. It is the kind of story that takes a moment to settle into. And tonight, we are going to take that time. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you right now as you listen to this? What does the air feel like around you? If you're somewhere warm tonight, somewhere with a blanket nearby, or the soft sound of a heater running in the background, maybe take a second to notice that. Because the world we're about to spend some time in is very different from that. The Arctic in winter is a place where the temperature can drop to 40 degrees below zero, where the sun does not rise for months, where the wind moves across flat ice with nothing to slow it down, and where the sea itself freezes solid for miles in every direction. It is a place that is genuinely hard to imagine from the inside of a warm room. But we will try. That is what tonight is for. And if you are enjoying this kind of storytelling, if you find yourself settling in and wanting more nights like this one, please consider leaving a like on this video. It genuinely helps the channel more than you might think, and it lets us keep making these long, slow, careful stories about the things that history half forgot. Subscribe if you haven't already. There is no pressure, but there is a lot more where this came from, and we would love to have you along for it. Now, the Baychimo. To understand what makes this story so strange, you have to start with what the ship was before it became a ghost, because it was not always a mystery. For the first part of its life, it was simply a vessel doing a job, moving through difficult waters on a reliable schedule, year after year, in service of a trading company that operated at the very edge of the known world. It was by most accounts a dependable ship, the kind that does not make news, the kind that just keeps going. And then it kept going in a way nobody expected. The Baychimo was built in 1914 in Hamburg, Germany, at the shipyard of Blohm and Voss, which was one of the most respected shipbuilding operations in the world at that time. It was constructed as a cargo and trading vessel, solid and practical, displacing around 1,322 tons. Not large by the standards of the era, but built for endurance rather than speed or grandeur. It was the kind of ship that was meant to work. In its early years, it operated under the name Angel, and it changed hands and names before eventually being acquired by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1921, at which point it was brought into service on the Arctic trading routes of the Canadian and Alaskan North. The Hudson's Bay Company, for those who are not familiar, was one of the oldest and most powerful commercial enterprises in North American history, originally chartered in 1670 and built on the fur trade. By the early 20th century, it was still operating trading posts across the Canadian North and into Alaska, exchanging goods with indigenous communities and transporting furs south to market. The Baychimo became one of the vessels that made this possible in the Western Arctic, running a route that stretched from Nome in Alaska east through the Beaufort Sea, stopping at communities along the way: Herschel Island, Barrow, Point Hope, Cambridge Bay and beyond. These were not easy stops to reach. The coastline was remote, the ice was unpredictable, and the season during which navigation was even possible was frustratingly short. Each summer, when the pack ice retreated enough to allow passage, ships like the Baychimo had a narrow window to complete their runs before the freeze closed in again. This was the world the Baychimo was built for, and for a decade it navigated it reliably. Every summer the ship went north, every autumn it came back. It carried fox pelts and seal skins, trade goods and supplies, moving between a world that most people in the south would never see and a commercial system that depended entirely on these cold, difficult voyages. The crew knew the rhythms of the Arctic season the way farmers know weather. They read the ice, watched the sky, made decisions based on experience and instinct. Captain John Cornwell, who commanded the Baychimo through these years, was a man who understood this environment as well as anyone. And then, in the autumn of 1931, the environment stopped cooperating. That October, the Baychimo was heading home from its trading run, loaded with furs, when the ice moved in faster than expected near Point Barrow. It was the kind of thing that happened in the Arctic. The freeze did not always wait for you to be ready. The ship became trapped, held fast in the pack ice, unable to move forward or back. The crew waited. The ice did not shift. Days passed. The Hudson's Bay Company eventually sent a rescue aircraft and airlifted most of the crew to safety, but Captain Cornwell and a group of 14 men chose to stay. They set up a wooden shelter camp on the ice, roughly half a mile from the ship, and settled in to wait out the freeze, hoping to reclaim the Baychimo when conditions improved in the spring. The conditions did not improve. The temperatures dropped to 40 below. The polar darkness settled in. The wind moved across the ice without interruption. The men lived in their shelter, close enough to see the ship waiting, and then in late November a blizzard came. It lasted 2 days. When it cleared and the men emerged from their shelter, they looked toward where the Baychimo had been. The ship was gone, not sunk, not wrecked, just gone, vanished into the ice and the storm, and that is where the real story begins. Not with the ship's construction, not with its years of reliable service, not even with the moment it became trapped. The story begins the moment it disappeared, because what happened next is the part that does not quite make sense, and the part that people in the Arctic would be talking about for the next 4 decades and beyond. The Baychimo had not gone to the bottom of the sea, it had simply moved, and it would keep moving. For 38 years it would keep moving, appearing to strangers in the fog, sheltering hunters from storms, resisting every attempt to reclaim it, drifting through a landscape that should have destroyed it in its first winter alone. A ship with no crew and no destination, wandering the top of the world long after everyone had stopped expecting to see it. In the sections ahead, we're going to follow that journey. We're going to look at where the ship came from, how it survived, who found it, and when, and what eventually became of it. Or at least what we think became of it, because the honest answer is that nobody knows for certain. The Baychimo's final resting place has never been confirmed. It may be on the seafloor of the Beaufort Sea, it may be grounded on some remote coastline, It may, in some form, still be locked in Arctic ice somewhere that no search party has yet reached. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to where this all began, to the years before the blizzard, before the abandonment, before the ghost ship became a ghost. Let us start with the ship when it was simply a ship, doing its job in one of the coldest and most demanding corners of the world. The Baychimo was built in Hamburg, Germany in 1914 at the Blohm & Voss shipyard, a name that carried real weight in the world of maritime construction. Blohm & Voss had been building ships since 1877, and by the early 20th century they were known for producing vessels that were solid, functional, and built to last. The Baychimo was not one of their glamorous commissions. It was not a passenger liner or a naval vessel. It was a working cargo ship designed to carry freight across cold and difficult waters, and everything about its construction reflected that purpose. The hull was steel. The displacement sat at around 1,322 tons. The ship measured roughly 230 feet in length, long enough to carry a meaningful cargo, compact enough to navigate coastal waters that larger vessels could not reach. It was launched during a period when the world was still months away from the outbreak of the First World War, and in those early years it operated under the name Angel, moving through the waters of the North Sea and the Baltic under various commercial arrangements, before eventually changing hands and finding its way, after a series of transfers, into the fleet of the Hudson's Bay Company in 1921. That acquisition was not random. The Hudson's Bay Company had very specific needs, and the Baychimo fit them well enough. By 1921, the company had been operating for well over 2 centuries. It was chartered by King Charles II of England in 1670, originally to pursue the fur trade through Hudson Bay and the rivers that fed into it. Over those 2.5 centuries it had evolved considerably, but the essential business of trading with indigenous communities in the Canadian North had never fully gone away. By the early 20th century, the company was running a network of trading posts across the Canadian Arctic and into Alaska, and to supply those posts and collect the furs they accumulated, it needed ships that could actually reach them. The Western Arctic coastline was not served by rail or road. The only reliable way in and out for much of the year was by sea, and even that was only possible for a few months each summer, when the ice pulled back far enough to allow passage. The Baychimo was assigned to this work, and its route became a kind of annual pilgrimage through some of the most remote and demanding waters on Earth. Starting from Nome, on the western coast of Alaska, the ship would work its way eastward through the Chukchi Sea and into the Beaufort Sea, stopping at communities and trading posts along the way. Barrow, which sits at the very top of Alaska, was one of the key stops, the northernmost city in the United States, a place where the Arctic Ocean meets the land in a way that is hard to describe if you have never seen it. Point Hope, further southwest along the Alaskan coast, was another. Herschel Island, a small and wind-battered piece of land just off the Yukon coastline in Canada, was another significant stop. It had been a whaling station in the 19th century, and still served as a waypoint for Arctic commerce. Cambridge Bay, deeper into the Canadian Arctic archipelago, was among the furthest points the Baychimo would reach on a good season. These were not easy places to get to. The pack ice in the Western Arctic does not behave in a simple, predictable way. It is not like a lake that freezes cleanly and thaws cleanly. Arctic sea ice is a dynamic, shifting, sometimes violent system. It presses together into ridges several meters high. It opens into leads of open water that can close again within hours. It moves with currents and winds in ways that experienced sailors could read but never fully predict. The navigable season in this part of the world was narrow. In a good year, ships might have from late July to early October to complete their runs before the freeze set in again. In a bad year, that window could shrink considerably. Every voyage carried the awareness that the ice could close in at any time, and that being caught in it was not a theoretical risk, but a very real one that had claimed ships before. The crew of the Baychimo lived inside this awareness for the entire duration of each voyage. They watched the sky for signs of changing weather. They watched the water for the greasy dark look that open Arctic water gets when ice is forming beneath the surface, a phenomenon called grease ice, which is exactly as ominous as it sounds. They watched the horizon for the white glare that reflected off distant ice fields, a phenomenon called ice blink, which could tell an experienced eye where the pack was even before it came into view. This was navigation by observation, by instinct, by years of accumulated knowledge about a particular stretch of water and what it was likely to do in a given week of a given month. Captain John Cornwell, who commanded the Baychimo through much of its Hudson's Bay Company service, was the kind of man who carried this knowledge in his bones. He had made these runs enough times to understand the rhythms of the route, and the crew that sailed with him had their own deep familiarity with the demands of Arctic work. What they were carrying on these voyages was, in its own way, a window into a whole world of commerce that most people in the South never thought about. The primary cargo coming back from the Arctic was fur, fox pelts mostly, particularly Arctic fox, which were prized for their thick, pale winter coats. Seal skins also made up a portion of the cargo. These were gathered through the Hudson's Bay Company's network of trading posts, where indigenous communities, Inuit and Yupik peoples across Alaska and the Canadian Arctic, would bring in furs in exchange for goods, tools, fabric, flour, tea, ammunition, and other supplies that had become part of the economic fabric of Arctic life by that period. It was a trade relationship with a long and complicated history, one that had reshaped indigenous economies across the north over the preceding 2 centuries. The Baychimo was simply one link in that chain, the vessel that moved the furs from the remote post to the markets further south. Going out, the ship carried those supplies and trade goods. Coming back, it was loaded with pelts. The cargo hold would be packed with bales of fur, carefully bundled and stacked, representing months of trapping work by dozens of families across thousands of miles of coastline. The value of that cargo was real and significant. A full load of Arctic fox pelts was worth a considerable sum in the early 1930s, and the Hudson's Bay Company tracked it carefully. This detail matters later, because when the Baychimo was eventually abandoned, the decision about whether to try to save the ship was partly a calculation about what the ship was worth compared to what it would cost to retrieve it. But in the years of reliable service from 1921 onward, none of that calculus was necessary. The ship went north, the ship came back, the cargo was unloaded, and the cycle repeated. A decade of this. 10 summers of navigating the pack ice, stopping at the same communities, carrying the same kinds of cargo, returning before the freeze. It is easy, looking back, to flatten that decade into a single sentence. 10 years of Arctic trading runs, but each of those voyages was its own experience, with its own weather and its own ice conditions and its own small crises and recoveries. The Arctic does not give you the same season twice. Some summers the ice retreated early and the passage was relatively open. Other summers the pack hung on longer than expected and the window was tight. There were years when the ship returned with a full cargo, and years when conditions forced shorter runs or detours. The crew navigated all of it, season after season, and the Baychimo held together through all of it. There is something quietly remarkable about that kind of sustained, unglamorous reliability. The Baychimo was not making news. It was not the subject of headlines. It was a working vessel doing its job in a part of the world that most people never thought about, serving a commercial system that depended on exactly this kind of dependable, unexciting service. It was, in the best sense of the phrase, a ship that did what it was supposed to do, and the people who worked on it, the crew who spent weeks at a time in Arctic waters, the indigenous traders who came to the ship's stops to exchange furs, the company men who managed the posts, all of them were part of a world that existed largely outside the awareness of anyone who lived further south. This is worth holding on to as the story moves forward, because the Baychimo's later legend tends to overshadow what came before it. The ghost ship narrative is so compelling that it can make the ship's earlier life feel like mere prologue, but those 10 years of service were not prologue. They were the substance of what the Baychimo was. A practical, hard-working vessel that had earned its place in the Arctic trade. The men who sailed it knew its sounds and its rhythms. They knew how it handled in a swell, how it responded when ice pressed against the hull, how the engine sounded when everything was running right. It was a ship they understood, and they trusted it. And then 1931 arrived. The trading season that year proceeded more or less as expected through the summer months. The Baychimo made its run along the coast, stopped at its usual points, collected its cargo of furs. By autumn the ship was heading back, loaded following the same route it had followed every year. Captain Cornwell and his crew had made this return journey before. They knew what to watch for. But October of 1931 had something different in mind. The ice came in faster than the season called for, pressing in around the ship near Point Barrow in a way that left no room to manoeuvre. Within a matter of days, the Baychimo was locked in place. The pack ice had closed around it, and the ship was not going anywhere on its own power. This was not an unprecedented situation. Ships got caught in the ice. It happened. The question was always what to do next. Wait and hope for a shift in conditions or take more decisive action. The Hudson's Bay Company, after assessing the situation, decided to send a rescue aircraft and airlift most of the crew to safety, rather than leave them stranded through an Arctic winter. Most of the men went, but Captain Cornwell and a group of 14 others chose to stay behind, setting up a camp in a wooden shelter they built on the ice, roughly half a mile from the ship. Their plan was to wait out the winter, keep an eye on the Baychimo, and reclaim it when conditions allowed in the spring. It was not a comfortable plan, but it was a reasonable one. Men had wintered in the Arctic before. The shelter was built, supplies were organised, and the long wait began. The temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The polar night settled over the landscape. The wind came across the ice without anything to stop it. The men kept to their shelter, kept their routines, kept watching the ship sitting out there in the frozen dark. And then, in late November, the blizzard arrived. 2 days of storm, the kind of Arctic blizzard that reduces visibility to almost nothing and makes the world feel like it has contracted to the few feet immediately around you. When it ended and the men stepped out of their shelter and looked toward where the Baychimo had been, there was nothing there. Just ice. Just the flat, white, featureless expanse of the frozen sea, and no ship anywhere in sight. Nobody knew it yet, but the Baychimo had just begun the strangest chapter of its existence. The working ship, the reliable vessel, the cargo carrier that had spent a decade doing its job quietly and without drama. It was gone. Or rather, it was not gone. It had simply moved, and it would keep moving through seasons and years and decades, through sightings and disappearances and failed attempts at recovery, becoming something that no one had planned for and no one quite knew how to explain. The question of where it went after that blizzard, and what kept it afloat, and who found it, and when, that is where the story now turns. A few days after the blizzard, when the men in the shelter had accepted that the ship was gone, and were beginning to reckon with what that meant, word came from an unexpected direction. An Inuit hunter named Aklahala had spotted the Baychimo, not wrecked, not broken apart, not lying on its side in the ice, floating, still intact, still upright. It had drifted roughly 45 miles from the position where it had been trapped, carried by the blizzard winds and the shifting pack ice to a new location somewhere out in the frozen sea. Cornwell's group made their way to it, and there it was, battered from the storm, obviously stressed, but afloat. The ship that had vanished in the blizzard had simply gone somewhere else. This was the first moment of something that would repeat itself many times over the next 4 decades. The Baychimo would disappear, and then it would be found again. Somewhere it had no business being, still floating, still more or less intact, as if the Arctic had decided to keep it rather than destroy it. Cornwell assessed the ship carefully. What he found was a vessel that had taken real punishment. The storm had done damage. The ice pressure had done more. His judgment, based on years of experience in these waters, was that the Baychimo was unlikely to survive the rest of the winter. The hull was compromised enough that he did not believe it would hold together through the months of ice pressure and cold still ahead. The most practical course of action, he decided, was to remove the cargo, the fur pelts that the ship had been carrying when it was trapped, and let the ship go. The furs were valuable. The ship, in his estimation, was probably not going to make it through the season regardless of what anyone did. The cargo was airlifted out, the pelts were saved, and the Baychimo was officially abandoned, left to whatever fate the Arctic had in store for it. The Hudson's Bay Company wrote it off. The crew moved on. The ship was gone, as far as anyone was concerned. It had been a good vessel, a reliable one, and it had served its purpose. That was that. Except it was not that, because the Baychimo did not sink. The weeks passed. The Arctic winter pressed down on the Beaufort Sea with all its usual severity. And somewhere out in that frozen expanse, the Baychimo kept floating. Nobody was watching it. Nobody was checking on it. There was no crew to pump bilges or adjust ballast or make repairs. There was just the ship, alone, in the ice, in the dark, in the cold, and it held together. To understand why this was possible, why a damaged, abandoned, unmanned cargo ship could survive an Arctic winter, and then another, it helps to think about what Arctic pack ice actually does to a vessel, and what it can do for one. The instinct is to think of pack ice as purely destructive, and it can be. Ice pressure is one of the most powerful forces a ship can face, and it has crushed far more heavily built vessels than the Baychimo. The Franklin expedition ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, were reinforced specifically for ice conditions and were still eventually destroyed by it. The Karluk, a vessel that got trapped in the same general region of the Western Arctic in 1913, was crushed and sunk within months. Ice is not a friendly medium for ships. It is cold and heavy and different, and it does not care what something costs to build. But pack ice is not uniform. It is not a single, solid mass pressing in from every direction with equal force. It moves and shifts and reorganizes itself constantly, and in doing so it creates conditions that are sometimes destructive and sometimes, strangely, almost protective. A ship that is sitting in a pocket of ice, surrounded by it, cradled in it, can actually be held upright and supported in a way that prevents it from taking on water. The ice presses against the hull from the sides, yes, but if the pressure is more or less even and the hull is strong enough to resist it without buckling, the ship ends up in a kind of frozen embrace. It is not comfortable, and it is not safe in any conventional sense, but it is also not sinking. The ship is being carried rather than crushed. The Baychimo's steel hull was a factor here. It was not a particularly new ship by 1931. It was 17 years old by the time it was abandoned, but it had been built at Blohm and Voss in Hamburg, a shipyard with a serious reputation, and its construction was solid. Steel hulls flex under pressure in ways that older wooden hulls cannot, and that flexibility within limits is an advantage in ice conditions. A hull that can give slightly without fracturing is a hull that can survive pressures that would split a more rigid structure. The Baychimo was not indestructible, but it was well made, and its construction gave it more resilience than a lesser ship might have had. There is also the matter of what the ship was carrying, or rather, what it was no longer carrying. When Cornwell made the decision to remove the fur cargo before abandoning the ship, he was thinking about the commercial value of the pelts. He was not thinking about hull buoyancy. But the effect of removing that cargo was to make the Baychimo significantly lighter. A lighter ship sits higher in the water. A ship that sits higher in the water has more freeboard, more hull above the waterline, and is less likely to take on water through any compromised sections of the hull. The empty holds that had once been packed with fox pelts and seal skins were now just air, and air is buoyant. The Baychimo, stripped of its cargo, was in some ways better positioned to float than it had been when fully loaded. The geography of the Western Arctic added another dimension to this. The Beaufort Sea and the Chukchi Sea, which together form the area where the Baychimo spent most of its drifting years, have particular ice circulation patterns driven by a combination of wind, ocean current, and the shape of the coastline. The Beaufort Gyre is a large, slow, clockwise circulation of water and ice in the Western Arctic basin, and it tends to keep ice, and anything caught in the ice, moving in broad, gradual loops rather than driving it directly into shore or into deep water. A vessel caught in this system could, in theory, be carried in wide arcs across the same general region, appearing in different locations at different times, without ever travelling in a straight line toward any particular fate. The Baychimo seems to have been caught in something like this pattern, turning up in different parts of the Beaufort and Chukchi region over the years, sometimes near the Alaskan coast, sometimes further offshore, sometimes near areas where it had been spotted before. None of this makes the Baychimo's survival simple or easy to explain. The combination of factors, the hull construction, the empty cargo holds, the ice dynamics, the specific geography of the region, all had to work together in a way that was genuinely unlikely. Most ships in similar circumstances did not survive. The Baychimo was not typical, but it was also not supernatural. It was physics and geography and a degree of good fortune that stretched over an improbable length of time. What is interesting, sitting with all of this, is how the ship's abandonment may have actually contributed to its survival. A crewed ship in distress burns fuel trying to manoeuvre, takes on water through compromised hull sections that nobody is monitoring, and eventually reaches a point where the crew has to make decisions about whether to stay or go. An abandoned ship has none of those dynamics. It does not try to fight the ice. It does not run its engine and stress its systems. It just sits there, passive, letting the ice do what the ice does. There is a strange irony in the idea that the Baychimo may have lasted longer precisely because it was left alone. The crew trying to save it might have hastened its end. By the time the first winter after abandonment had passed and the Arctic summer of 1932 arrived, the Baychimo had already been drifting for several months without anyone aboard. The ice loosened its grip, as it does every summer, and the ship moved more freely. And that summer, a group of Inuit hunters came across it. They did not know at that moment what they were looking at in terms of its full story. What they knew was that there was a ship, alone, with no crew, sitting in the water. And they did what practical people in a demanding environment do when they encounter a useful structure. They went aboard and used it. The ship offered shelter, and shelter in the Arctic is never something to be passed by lightly. They spent time aboard, waited out weather that would have been miserable to face in the open, and then went on their way. The Baychimo had its first passengers since abandonment, not rescuers, not salvagers, just people who needed a roof and found one. This encounter, brief as it was, is worth pausing on. The Inuit hunters who sheltered in the Baychimo in 1932 were not experiencing a ghost ship in the way that the phrase tends to imply. They were experiencing an empty vessel that happened to be available. The ghost ship mythology that grew up around the Baychimo came largely from outside the Arctic, from newspapers in southern Canada and the United States that found the story of a drifting, unmanned ship romantic and eerie. For the people who actually lived and worked in the Western Arctic, the Baychimo was something more matter of fact, a known presence in the landscape, something to be aware of, something that might be useful if you encountered it. That is a very different relationship with the ship than the one that its legend suggests. The following year, 1933, a man named Leslie Melvin, a trapper working in the region, came across the Baychimo and boarded it. He spent a period of time aboard exploring the vessel, taking stock of what was there. By now the ship had been drifting for about 2 years, and Melvin found it in a condition that was deteriorating but still recognisable as a functioning vessel. The interior was cold and damp and growing more disordered with each passing season, but the basic structure was intact. He did not attempt to sail it. He did not try to claim it in any formal sense. He simply spent time aboard and then left, and later told people what he had found. His account added another data point to the growing picture of the Baychimo as something that was simply out there, somewhere in the Western Arctic, continuing to exist in defiance of all reasonable expectation. In 1934, a group of prospectors spotted the ship near Herschel Island, a small island off the Yukon coast that had long been a gathering point for Arctic whalers and traders. Herschel Island is hundreds of miles from Point Barrow, where the Baychimo had originally been trapped. The ship had moved, as it always did, following whatever combination of ice current and wind had taken it there. The prospectors saw it from a distance. By the time they might have reached it, it had moved on. This pattern, spotted, approached, or boarded, then gone again, would repeat itself across the years. The Baychimo was not hiding exactly. It was just moving, constantly, following the ice, and the Arctic is large enough and remote enough that a ship can be in a particular location one week and completely unreachable the next. By the mid-1930s, the ship had been drifting for 3 or 4 years and had been seen by enough different people and enough different places that its story was beginning to reach a wider audience. Newspapers were picking it up. The phrase ghost ship was starting to attach itself to the Baychimo in print, and once a story gets that label, it tends to take on a life of its own. But underneath the growing legend, there was still a real ship, made of real steel, drifting through real water and real ice, and the question of what was happening to it physically, how it was holding together, what the years of exposure were doing to its hull and its structure, was one that each new sighting helped answer a little and never fully resolved. Every person who boarded the Baychimo added something to the record of its condition, and the record, taken together, told a story of slow but steady decline, a ship that was holding on but not holding on forever. The question was never really whether the Baychimo would eventually succumb to the Arctic. The question was when and under what circumstances, and whether anyone would be there to see it when it did. Those questions would take decades more to approach, and even then they would not be fully answered. But the ship was still out there, still moving, and the next chapter of its strange second life was still being written. To understand how the Baychimo ended up drifting at all, you have to go back to the autumn of 1931 and follow the season as it turned. Because what happened that October was not a single dramatic event. It was more like a slow tightening. The kind that the Arctic does quietly without announcement, until the moment you realise there is no way out. The Baychimo had completed its trading run that summer. The holds were full of fur pelts, fox mostly, collected along the Alaskan and Canadian Arctic coastlines during the season stops. Captain John Cornwell and his crew were heading home, following the route they knew well, the same route they had worked for a decade. The plan was straightforward: get back before the ice closed in. This was always the plan. Every year the timing was slightly different, and every year the crew watched the weather and the water with the particular attention of people who understood what the ice could do if you underestimated it. In October of 1931, the ice came early. The Baychimo was near Point Barrow, Alaska, the northernmost point of the United States, a place where the Chukchi Sea and the Beaufort Sea meet, and where the pack ice tends to move in ways that are not always predictable even to people who have spent their lives watching it. The ship slowed as the ice thickened around it. Then it stopped. The hull was held fast, gripped from all sides by ice that had no interest in releasing it. Cornwell waited. The crew waited. They had been in tight situations before, and sometimes the ice shifted on its own, opened a lead, gave you a path. This time it did not. Days passed. The temperature dropped. The sun was already spending less and less time above the horizon, and the quality of the light had shifted to that flat, grey-white that signals the long polar darkness coming. The Baychimo sat in the ice, going nowhere, and the question of what to do next became increasingly urgent. The Hudson's Bay Company, informed of the situation, made the decision to send a rescue aircraft. This was not a small operation in 1931. Aviation in the Arctic was still relatively new and not without risk, but the company had resources and the crew's safety was a priority. The plane came and most of the men were airlifted out. The cargo, those valuable fox pelts, was also removed, or at least a significant portion of it. Getting people out was the first concern, but Captain Cornwell did not leave. He and a group of 14 men chose to stay. This decision deserves a moment of consideration because it was not reckless. It was practical, in the way that decisions made by experienced Arctic hands often are. The reasoning was straightforward. If the ice shifted in the spring, the ship might be recoverable. Abandoning it entirely without anyone standing watch seemed premature. The Baychimo was a working vessel with real value to the company, and if there was a chance of saving it, Cornwall wanted to be there to take that chance. So he stayed, and 14 men stayed with him, and they set about making themselves as comfortable as possible in one of the least comfortable places on Earth. They built a shelter, not aboard the ship. The ship was locked in ice and increasingly difficult to access and heat, but on the ice itself, about half a mile from the Baychimo's hull. A wooden structure purpose-built for the situation, insulated as best they could manage with the materials available. It was not luxury accommodation, but it was shelter, and shelter is the difference between survival and not surviving, when the temperature is dropping toward minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Minus 40 is one of those figures that is hard to really picture if you have not experienced it. At that temperature, the distinction between Fahrenheit and Celsius stops mattering because they meet at the same number. Exposed skin freezes in minutes. Breath turns to ice crystals before it disperses. Metal becomes brittle. The cold is not just a discomfort, it is a constant, active pressure on everything around you, including the hull of a ship. The men in their wooden shelter understood this. They had their routines, their watches, their small stove, their rations. They were waiting. The ship was 50 yards away in the ice, and they were waiting for the season to turn. November arrived, and with November came a blizzard. Arctic storms at that latitude in November are not gentle weather events. They are multi-day affairs, complete whiteouts where visibility drops to almost nothing, and the wind pushes the temperature into a range that makes the already brutal ambient cold feel almost nostalgic. This particular blizzard lasted 2 days. The men stayed in their shelter, as you would, and waited for it to pass. There was nothing else to do. The storm was in charge, and the only reasonable response was to let it finish. When it cleared, they went to check on the ship. The Baychimo was gone, not wrecked, not sunk, or at least not visibly, just gone. The place where the ship had been sitting in the ice was empty. The ice itself had shifted during the storm, rearranged itself as Arctic ice does when a strong wind gets behind it, and the Baychimo had gone with it. Cornwall and his men stood at the edge of where the ship had been and looked out at ice and sky and nothing else. After a decade of reliable service, after all those summer voyages and fur-laden holds and careful navigation through the same waters, the Baychimo had simply vanished into a blizzard. The immediate assumption, the reasonable assumption, was that the ship had been crushed by the moving ice and sunk. This happens. It is in fact one of the more common fates for vessels caught in Arctic pack ice. The pressure that ice can exert on a hull is enormous, and ships have been destroyed this way in a matter of hours. The Baychimo was a steel-hulled vessel, which offered some resistance, but steel is not invincible. Cornwall's group had no way of knowing what had happened. They only knew the ship was not where it had been. And then, a few days later, word came. An Inuit hunter named Aklahala had spotted the Baychimo. Not at the bottom of the sea, not broken apart on the ice, but afloat, drifting roughly 45 miles from its original position. The storm had moved it. The ice had carried it, shifted it, and released it somewhere else entirely, and there it sat, battered but floating, apparently intact enough to remain on the surface. Cornwall's group made their way to the ship. What they found when they reached it was a vessel that had clearly been through something. The blizzard and the moving ice had not been kind. There was damage. The ship looked rough, but it was there, and it was floating, and the question now was what to do with it. Cornwall assessed the situation carefully. He was an experienced captain who understood both ships and Arctic conditions, and what he concluded was this. The Baychimo, in its current state, was unlikely to survive another Arctic winter. The damage it had sustained, combined with the ongoing pressure of the ice and the months of cold still ahead, made the prospect of getting the ship through to spring and then successfully sailing it out seem unrealistic. The risk of attempting to stay with the ship, or of trying to sail it in its compromised condition, outweighed the potential reward. There was also the question of the cargo. The fur pelts still aboard, whatever had not been removed during the earlier airlift, were valuable, and they could be taken out regardless of what happened to the ship itself. So that is what was arranged. The remaining cargo was removed, airlifted out to safety. The furs were the priority, and the furs were saved. The Baychimo was officially abandoned. This is the moment the story properly begins, in a sense, because up until this point, everything that had happened was within the range of normal Arctic maritime misfortune. Ships got caught in ice, crews were evacuated, cargo was salvaged. Vessels were written off. These things happened, and they were unfortunate, but they were not remarkable. What made the Baychimo remarkable was what came next. It did not sink. A ship that has been officially abandoned, assessed as too damaged to survive, and left alone in the Arctic in November of 1931 should, by most reasonable calculations, not be seen again. Or if it is seen again, it should be as wreckage, broken hull, scattered debris, the kind of remains that tell a clear story of an ending. The Baychimo offered none of that. It simply kept floating. It kept drifting. It kept being somewhere, even if that somewhere was always changing. The decision to abandon the ship was made in good faith, based on a reasonable reading of the evidence available at the time. Cornwell was not being careless or dismissive. He looked at a damaged vessel in a brutal environment and made the judgment call that the ship was not going to make it. He was wrong, as it turned out, but wrong in a way that no one could have predicted. The Baychimo had other plans, or rather, the Arctic did. The ice that had seemed like the ship's destroyer became, in a strange reversal, something closer to its protector. The men who had stayed through those weeks on the ice sleeping in a wooden shelter half a mile from their ship, watching the temperature drop and the darkness deepen, would have had no way of knowing as they finally left that they were not saying goodbye to a wreck. They were saying goodbye to the beginning of one of the strangest stories in maritime history. The ship they left behind was not finished. It was, in a sense, just getting started. What Cornwell and his crew could not have known, what no one could have known at the time, was that the particular combination of factors at work in that stretch of the Western Arctic would allow the Baychimo to continue existing long past any reasonable expectation. The ice, the cold, the specific geography of the Beaufort and Chukchi seas, the construction of the hull, all of it would come together in a way that kept the ship afloat through conditions that should have ended it many times over. The blizzard that seemed to have swallowed the Baychimo whole had, in fact, done something stranger. It had set it free into a kind of second life. The winter of 1931 and 1932 passed. The polar darkness gave way, slowly, to the returning light of the Arctic spring, and then to the brief, bright summer that the region allows. The ice loosened, leads opened in the pack, and somewhere in the Western Arctic the Baychimo was moving with it all, drifting on whatever current and wind the season provided, carrying no crew, running no engine, going wherever the ice decided to take it. By the time summer arrived and the ice retreated enough for travel, the ship had been alone for months. And it was in that summer of 1932 that the sightings began, not in a dramatic way, not with any fanfare, but quietly, as things in the Arctic tend to happen. The ship was out there. People were starting to find it. And the story of the Baychimo's long, improbable second life was beginning to take shape in the accounts of the hunters and trappers and travellers who moved through those waters and came across something they had not expected to find. A ship, alone, with no one aboard, still floating, still drifting, still somehow there. But let us go back for a moment, because the story of the first rediscovery deserves to be told carefully. It is easy, in a narrative like this one, to rush past the early details in order to get to the long sweep of decades and sightings. But the first time the Baychimo was found after the blizzard, that specific quiet moment, is actually the hinge on which everything else turns. It is the moment that changed what kind of story this was going to be. A few days after the blizzard cleared, an Inuit hunter named Aklahala was moving through the area when he spotted the Baychimo. Not wreckage, not debris scattered across the ice. The ship itself, intact, still upright, still floating in open water or loose pack ice, roughly 45 miles from where it had last been anchored. 45 miles. That is not a small distance in any context, but in the Arctic in November, in the aftermath of a 2-day blizzard, it is a remarkable displacement. The ice had moved the ship, carried it essentially the way a river carries a log, and set it down again somewhere else entirely. Aklahala brought word of this to Cornwall's group, and so the men who had been sitting in their wooden shelter on the ice, assuming the ship was gone and likely destroyed, were told that it was not. It was out there, it was floating, it was 45 miles away. They made their way to it. The journey itself across Arctic ice in late November would not have been easy, but they reached the ship and they climbed aboard and they looked at what the blizzard and the ice had left them. The Baychimo was battered. There was visible damage. The ship had clearly been through something violent. Ice pressure does not move a 1,300-ton steel vessel gently, and the effects of being dragged or pushed or lifted through a blizzard over dozens of miles would have left marks. But the hull was holding, the ship was afloat. It had not broken apart, had not capsized, had not taken on enough water to go under. It was damaged, but it was recognisably a ship, and it was still on the surface of the sea. This is the first moment in the story where something genuinely unusual announces itself. Not the blizzard, not the abandonment. Those things fit within the expected range of Arctic maritime hardship. The unusual thing is this. The ship had survived the blizzard. It had survived being moved 45 miles through the ice. It was still there. Cornwall looked at the Baychimo with the eyes of an experienced Arctic captain, and what he saw was a vessel that was, in his judgment, too compromised to make it through the rest of the winter. The damage was real. The conditions were brutal and would only get worse. The Arctic winter still had months ahead of it, and the ice was not going to become more forgiving. His assessment was that the ship, left to the elements from this point forward, would not survive until spring. Whether that meant it would be crushed by ice pressure, or gradually flooded, or simply broken apart by the movement of the pack, the specific mechanism did not matter as much as the conclusion. The Baychimo was not going to make it. There was still the matter of the cargo. The fur pelts that remained aboard were valuable. Fox furs collected along the trading route, worth real money to the Hudson's Bay Company. The earlier airlift had taken some of the crew and some supplies, but there was still cargo on the ship, and that cargo could be recovered regardless of what happened to the vessel itself. So arrangements were made. The remaining furs were removed from the Baychimo and airlifted out to safety. The pelts were the priority and the pelts were saved. The company's most recoverable asset from the voyage was secured, and then the ship was left behind. Officially, formally, deliberately abandoned. The Hudson's Bay Company wrote off the vessel. Cornwall and his men departed. The Baychimo was left alone in the Western Arctic in late November 1931, assessed as too damaged to survive, with no crew, no running engine, no one to manage its pumps or watch its hull, or make any of the 1,000 small decisions that keep a ship alive through a hard winter. It was left to the ice and the cold and whatever came next. What came next, of course, was that it did not sink. This is where the story becomes something other than a straightforward account of an Arctic maritime loss. Because the expected ending had already been written. Experienced captain, reasonable assessment, logical conclusion. The ship was damaged. The winter was brutal. The odds were poor. The Baychimo should have gone down quietly somewhere in the Beaufort Sea, and the story should have ended with a brief notation in the Hudson's Bay Company's records. Vessel lost. November 1931. Arctic conditions. Cargo recovered. That would have been a complete and unremarkable story. Dozens of ships had similar endings in those waters. The Arctic is full of them. Instead, the Baychimo floated. It drifted. It moved with the ice through that first winter, and then through the spring, and then into the summer of 1932, and it kept being somewhere. Not a fixed somewhere. It was never in the same place for long, never anchored, never still in any permanent sense. But it was somewhere. It was on the surface. It was intact enough to remain afloat. And that is the detail that changes everything about the story. Not that the ship was found again, but that there was something intact to find. The question of why the Baychimo kept floating is one we will come back to in more detail. The physics of it, the geography, the specific conditions of the Western Arctic that made this possible. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of the abandonment, what matters is simply the fact of it. The ship was left. The ship did not sink. These two things, in combination, set the stage for everything that followed across the next 38 years. There is something almost disorienting about Cornwell's position in this story. He made a reasonable decision. He looked at the available evidence, applied his considerable experience, and reached a conclusion that any competent mariner in his situation would likely have reached. He was not being reckless or lazy. He was being practical. And he was wrong, not through any failure of judgment, but because the Baychimo turned out to be more resilient than the evidence suggested it should be. That is a strange kind of wrongness to carry. Not the wrongness of a mistake, but the wrongness of an outcome that defied the logic of the situation. The ship simply refused to behave the way damaged ships in Arctic winters are supposed to behave. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it gets at something central to what makes the Baychimo story so persistent in the imagination. We are accustomed, in most stories about ships and the sea, to the idea that the sea wins eventually. It always wins. It is patient and vast and indifferent, and sooner or later it takes what it wants. The Arctic version of this is especially stark. The ice is not just water. It is a crushing, grinding, relentless force that has destroyed ships far sturdier than the Baychimo. And yet here was this aging cargo vessel, already assessed as beyond saving, drifting through one of the most hostile maritime environments on Earth, and simply not sinking. Not for months, not for years, not for decades. The men who had lived on the ice beside the ship through those weeks in November the 1931, who had slept in a wooden shelter half a mile from the Baychimo while the temperature dropped to around -40 degrees Fahrenheit and the polar darkness settled in completely, those men had been through something genuinely hard. They had stayed not out of stubbornness, but out of a real hope that the ship might be saved. And in the end, they had watched the blizzard take it, and they had made peace with the loss, and they had left. The fact that the ship had not actually been lost, that it had only moved, was something they could not have known. And by the time Aklahala's report reached them and they made their way to the ship and confirmed it was still afloat, the decision about what to do had already been made in practical terms. The cargo was the priority. The ship was the loss. That was the calculation, and they stuck to it. What is interesting is that Cornwell's assessment was not obviously wrong even after the ship was found still floating. A damaged vessel surviving a few days after a blizzard is not the same thing as a damaged vessel surviving an entire Arctic winter. Finding the Baychimo still afloat in late November did not guarantee it would still be afloat in April. Cornwell's judgment that the ship would not survive the remaining winter then was still plausible even after the rediscovery. He was working with the information available to him, in the conditions available to him, and his conclusion was defensible. The fact that the ship went on to float for another 38 years is something he had no way of predicting. No one did. Aklahala's role in this story is worth pausing on briefly, because it is easy for his name to appear once and then disappear from the narrative. But he was the first person to find the Baychimo after the blizzard. He was moving through those waters on his own purposes, hunting, travelling, doing the work of his life in the landscape he knew, and he came across a large steel ship floating alone in the ice, 45 miles from where anyone expected it to be. He reported what he had seen. That report led directly to the recovery of the cargo and the official abandonment decision. Without that sighting, the furs might have been lost along with the ship. The whole trajectory of the story would have been different. Aklahala's encounter with the Baychimo was brief and practical, not dramatic, but it was consequential. He saw the ship, he told people, and that set everything else in motion. After the cargo was removed and the abandonment was formalised, the Baychimo entered a kind of liminal state. It was not a wreck, because it had not wrecked. It was not an active vessel, because it had no crew and no purpose. It was not lost exactly, because people knew roughly where it had last been seen. It was simply there, somewhere out in the western Arctic, drifting with the ice, belonging to no one in any practical sense, doing nothing except floating. The Hudson's Bay Company had written it off. The crew was gone, the cargo was gone. The ship was, in the language of maritime law, abandoned. And abandoned ships, in most circumstances, either sink or are salvaged. The Baychimo did neither. It drifted through the winter of 1931 and 1932. The polar darkness came and went. The temperatures that would have seemed extreme to almost anyone not from the Arctic, the kind of cold that makes metal brittle and breath visible from across a room, came and went as well. The ice shifted and moved in the patterns that the Beaufort and Chukchi seas have followed for thousands of years, driven by currents and winds that operate on scales far larger than any single ship. And the Baychimo moved with all of it, carried along by forces it could not resist and did not need to resist, because there was no one aboard to resist them on its behalf. The ship simply went where the ice took it, and then, as the Arctic summer arrived and the ice retreated enough to allow travel, people began to move through those waters again. Hunters, trappers, traders, travellers, the human traffic of the Arctic summer, modest but real, threading through the leads and open stretches of water that the retreating pack left behind. And some of those people, moving through waters where they had perhaps heard a story about an abandoned ship, or perhaps had heard nothing at all, came across something unexpected. A ship, alone, no crew, no flag, no sound. Just sitting there in the water, or nudged against the ice, or drifting slowly in a current, as if it had always been there and had simply been waiting to be noticed. The sightings that began in 1932 were not, at first, widely reported or widely known. They were the accounts of people in the Arctic doing Arctic things, hunters and travellers who encountered something strange and mentioned it to others. Word spread in the way that word spreads in small, isolated communities, slowly, personally, through the telling of stories. The Baychimo had been a known ship on these routes for a decade. People who lived and worked in the Western Arctic knew it, or knew of it. When it started appearing again after its abandonment, the news had a specific texture to it, not the abstract strangeness of a ghost ship story told from a distance, but the concrete, practical strangeness of a familiar vessel showing up where it had no business being, with no one aboard, still floating. That quality, the combination of familiarity and wrongness, is part of what gave the Baychimo its particular hold on the imagination of the people who encountered it. It was not an unknown ship found mysteriously at sea. It was a ship people knew, or knew about, appearing in the wrong context entirely. A ship without a crew is always strange. A specific ship that you know was abandoned and written off, showing up intact years later, is stranger still. And that strangeness was going to accumulate, sighting by sighting, year by year, for a very long time to come. The 1930s were just beginning. The Baychimo had only just started its second life. And the people who would encounter it over the next several decades, the hunters who would shelter inside it, the trappers who would climb aboard and walk its empty decks, the pilots who would spot it from the air and radio in their coordinates, none of them knew yet that they were part of a story that was going to keep going for almost 4 more decades. They just knew what they saw. A ship, alone, in the ice, still there, still floating, going nowhere in particular, and going there slowly, and somehow surviving every winter that came for it. So before we follow those first sightings any further, it is worth pausing here for a moment. Because the question that sits underneath all of this, the question that makes the Baychimo story genuinely strange rather than simply sad, is not why the ship was abandoned. That part makes sense. The question is why it did not sink. Most ships, when left alone in the Arctic, do not last 38 years. Most ships, when left alone in the Arctic, do not last one winter. The ice alone should have been enough to end it. Ice pressure in the Western Arctic is not a gentle thing. Pack ice in the Beaufort and Chukchi seas can exert forces measured in thousands of tons per square metre. It has crushed steel-hulled ships within days of entrapment. It has bent frames, split seams, and driven vessels to the seafloor in a matter of hours once it decided to close in seriously. The history of Arctic exploration is full of ships that met exactly that fate. Good ships, well-built ships, ships with crews trying actively to protect them, and they sank anyway. The Baychimo had no crew. No one was pumping bilges, monitoring the hull, reinforcing weak points, or making any of the 1,000 small decisions that keep a vessel alive in difficult conditions. It was simply there, alone, subject to everything the Arctic could throw at it. And yet, it floated. The answer, to the extent that there is one, lies in a combination of factors that came together in a way that was unusual enough to produce an unusual result. None of these factors individually was magical or even particularly remarkable. Together, though, they created conditions that allowed a steel cargo ship to drift through one of the harshest maritime environments on Earth for nearly 4 decades without sinking. It is worth understanding each of them, because the Baychimo's survival was not a miracle. It was physics. Extraordinary physics, in an extraordinary place, but physics nonetheless. Start with the ice itself. Pack ice in the Western Arctic does not behave as a single uniform mass. It is dynamic, constantly moving, fragmenting, refreezing, shifting under the influence of wind, ocean currents, and temperature gradients that change day by day and season by season. The Beaufort Sea, which sits north of Alaska and the Yukon, and the Chukchi Sea, which lies just to its west, are both characterized by what oceanographers call the Beaufort Gyre, a large, slow, clockwise circulation of water and ice driven by atmospheric pressure systems over the Arctic Ocean. This gyre moves ice in broad, sweeping arcs across the Western Arctic, carrying whatever is embedded in it along for the ride. A ship caught in this circulation does not simply sit still and get crushed. It moves. It travels with the ice, carried along by the same forces that move the ice itself, and because it is moving with those forces rather than against them, the pressure on its hull is often far less than you might expect. This is a counterintuitive thing about sea ice and ships. The most dangerous moment for a vessel caught in pack ice is often not when the ice is moving. It is when the ice is stationary and 2 masses of it are being driven together by external forces, with the ship caught between them. When a ship is moving with the ice, embedded in it and carried along as part of the same drifting mass, the relative forces on the hull can actually be quite modest. The ship is not fighting the ice. It is simply going where the ice goes, and in the Beaufort Gyre that means drifting in long, slow loops through the Western Arctic, covering hundreds of miles over months and years, but without the catastrophic compression events that destroy vessels caught in converging ice fields. There is another aspect of pack ice behaviour that is relevant here, and it is one that sounds almost protective when you describe it. Under certain conditions, pack ice does not crush a vessel. It cradles it. When ice forms around a hull gradually, freezing in layers rather than slamming in from both sides, it can actually support the ship, holding it upright, preventing it from rolling or taking on water through any compromised seams, essentially acting as a slow-moving floating dock. The ship sits in its ice cradle, held more or less level, protected on all sides from wave action and the kind of dynamic water movement that would stress a hull in open sea. This is not a guarantee of survival. Ice can shift and the cradle can become a vice in a matter of hours. But it is a real phenomenon, and it likely contributed to the Baychimo's longevity in ways that are hard to quantify, but impossible to ignore. The Baychimo's hull construction also matters here. The ship was built in 1914 at Blohm and Voss in Hamburg, a shipyard with a serious reputation for quality construction. Its steel hull was not designed specifically for Arctic conditions the way that purpose-built icebreakers are. It was a cargo vessel, not an ice-class ship. But it was solidly made. Steel hulls in cold water behave differently than in warmer seas. The corrosion processes that degrade steel in salt water slow down significantly at low temperatures. The biological fouling, barnacles, marine growth, the organisms that attach to a hull and begin breaking it down, is minimal in Arctic waters, particularly in winter. A steel ship in the Beaufort Sea is not experiencing the same rate of deterioration that the same ship would face in, say, the Gulf of Mexico or the North Atlantic. The cold, paradoxically, is part of what kept the Baychimo alive. The very environment that should have destroyed it was also slowing down the processes that would have caused it to decay. Then there is the question of buoyancy. And this is where the abandonment decision in November 1931 becomes unexpectedly significant. When Captain Cornwell made the call to remove the fur cargo before leaving the ship, he was thinking about commercial value. Those pelts were worth money, and there was no reason to leave them on a vessel that was being written off. But the practical effect of removing that cargo was to make the Baychimo significantly lighter. A cargo ship riding high in the water with less weight pressing its hull downward, sits differently in the ice. Its draft, the depth of hull below the waterline, is shallower. It is, in a meaningful sense, more buoyant, not because anything changed about the hull itself, but because there is simply less weight pushing it down. A lighter ship in pack ice is in some ways a more survivable ship. It can be lifted slightly by ice pressure rather than crushed by it. It can ride over forming ice rather than being pinned beneath it. The decision to remove the cargo was made for entirely practical commercial reasons, but it may have inadvertently extended the Baychimo's life by decades. The geography of the Western Arctic also played a role. The Beaufort and Chukchi seas are, in large parts, relatively shallow compared to the deep Arctic Ocean further north. Shallow water means that a drifting ship is more likely to ground on a shoal or a coastal shelf than to sink into deep water and be lost entirely. It also means that the ice dynamics are different. Shallower water produces different ice formation patterns, different pressure ridges, different seasonal rhythms of freezing and thaw. The specific geography of the region the Baychimo drifted through was not uniform, and the ship's path through it, determined entirely by the currents and winds acting on the ice, happened to keep it in areas where survival was, if not easy, at least possible. Whether this was luck or something more systematic in the Beaufort Gaia's circulation patterns is a question that is genuinely hard to answer. Probably some of both. It is also worth thinking about what the Arctic winter actually does to the water surface. During the months of maximum freeze, the Beaufort Sea is not open water with ice floating in it. It is, in large areas, a continuous surface of ice with water beneath it. A ship embedded in that surface is, in a sense, no longer at sea at all. It is sitting in a frozen landscape, held in place, not moving relative to the ice around it, not subject to wave action or dynamic water pressure. The stresses on the hull during those months are primarily from ice pressure and temperature contraction, not from the kind of dynamic loading that comes from waves and swells. And then, as summer arrives, and the ice retreats, the ship is released again, thawed out, refloated, returned to the water, and the cycle begins again, year after year. The Baychimo went through this cycle repeatedly, and each time it survived the freeze and the thaw, it was still there when the ice retreated. None of this means that the Baychimo's survival was inevitable, or even likely. If you had asked any Arctic mariner in 1931 whether an abandoned cargo ship could drift unmanned through the Western Arctic for 30 or 40 years without sinking, the answer would almost certainly have been no. The combination of factors that allowed it to happen The specific ice dynamics of the Beaufort Gyre, the ship's construction, the removal of its cargo, the shallow geography of the region, the cold temperatures that slowed corrosion, was genuinely unusual. Unusual enough that nothing quite like it has been documented before or since in Arctic maritime history. The Baychimo was not unique because of what it was. It was unique because of where it was, and when, and how all the conditions of its particular situation happened to line up in a way that kept it afloat long past any reasonable expectation. What is interesting, though, is that understanding the physics does not entirely dissolve the strangeness of the story. If anything, it deepens it. Because now you can see that the Baychimo was not simply drifting randomly. It was being carried systematically by one of the largest and most consistent circulation systems in the Arctic Ocean. The Beaufort Gyre was moving it in broad arcs, covering enormous distances over years, bringing it back to roughly the same regions again and again. This is part of why the sightings were spread across such a wide area, but still remained within a recognisable geographic zone. The ship was not lost in the sense of being scattered randomly across the ocean. It was lost in the sense of being embedded in a system too large and too complex for anyone to track from the outside, appearing at the surface of that system periodically, like something caught in a slow, cold current that had its own logic, its own rhythm, its own direction. And the people who encountered the Baychimo in the years and decades after its abandonment were encountering it at those moments of surfacing, when the Jusser brought it into waters where humans travelled, where hunters moved across the ice, where trappers made their rounds, where the occasional aircraft flew low enough to spot a dark shape in the white. Each sighting was a brief intersection between the ship's vast, slow, involuntary journey and the much smaller, much more purposeful journeys of the people who happened to cross its path. The ship did not come to them. They came across it, the way you might come across something unexpected in a landscape you thought you knew well. A thing out of place, a thing that should not be there, a thing that makes you stop and look twice, and then tell someone about it when you get home. The physics explains the survival, the geography explains the drift, the cold explains the slow decay, but none of it quite explains the feeling that people described when they encountered the Baychimo. That particular quality of strangeness that comes from finding a large, intact, recognisable vessel, completely alone in one of the most remote stretches of water on Earth. That feeling does not have a scientific explanation. It is just what it is. And it is the feeling that turns a story about ice dynamics and hull construction into something else. Something that people kept telling, kept passing on, kept finding worth remembering decades after the ship itself had disappeared from view. The physics got the Baychimo through the winters, the stories got it through everything else, and the stories were just beginning to accumulate when the 1930s opened up and the first of the sightings started coming in, each one adding another detail to a picture that was growing stranger and more remarkable with every passing year. The first sighting came in 1932, roughly a year after the Baychimo had been abandoned on the ice near Point Barrow. A group of Inuit hunters was moving through the Western Arctic when they came across the ship, still afloat, still intact, drifting alone in the cold water. What they did next says something about the practical relationship that Arctic communities had with the landscape they lived in. They did not stand at a distance and marvel at it. They boarded it. And when a storm came in, they sheltered inside it, using the abandoned vessel the way you might use any solid structure that happened to be available in a place where solid structures were rare and the weather was serious. The ship kept them safe through the storm. Then they left, and the Baychimo drifted on. There is something quietly remarkable about that first encounter. These hunters were not there to investigate a mystery or confirm a legend. They were travelling, doing what people in that part of the world had always done, and they came across something unexpected and dealt with it practically. The Baychimo for them was not primarily a ghost ship. It was a shelter, a windbreak, a place to wait out bad weather. That the ship had no business being there, that it had been abandoned the previous year and should by any reasonable expectation have sunk or been crushed by ice, was probably noted and talked about. But the immediate response was practical. This is one of the things that makes the Baychimo's story feel different from the kind of ghost ship tales that get told in ports and bars. The people who actually encountered it, especially in the early years, were not spooked by it. They were curious, sometimes opportunistic, and occasionally very glad it was there. The 1933 encounter was different in character. A trapper named Leslie Melvin came across the Baychimo somewhere in the same general stretch of Western Arctic water and actually spent time aboard it, not just sheltering during a storm but exploring the vessel, moving through its spaces, taking stock of what was there. Melvin's account, as it was later reported, described a ship that was weathered and cold but structurally present. The interior was deteriorating, as you would expect from a steel vessel that had spent more than a year in Arctic conditions with no heating, no maintenance, no human presence to slow the natural processes of rust and freeze and thaw working on every surface. But it was recognisable. The spaces were still spaces. The ship was still a ship. Melvin reportedly spent enough time aboard to get a real sense of the vessel's condition, and what he took away from the experience was not primarily fear or awe, but something more like the quiet strangeness of being in a place that felt inhabited and uninhabited at the same time. A ship that looked like it should have a crew and did not. Word of these encounters was spreading. The Baychimo was not just a story moving through Arctic communities by word of mouth, though it was certainly that. By the early 1930s, newspapers in Canada and to some extent the United States had begun picking up the story. The initial abandonment in 1931 had been reported. The Hudson's Bay Company vessel trapped in ice, the crew airlifted out, the ship left behind, and then the subsequent sightings, coming in sporadically, were enough to keep the story alive in print. There was something about it that editors seemed to recognise as inherently compelling. A ship with no crew, drifting through one of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth, appearing to people at irregular intervals like something from a sailor's dream. The word ghost ship was probably inevitable. In 1934, a group of prospectors spotted the Baychimo near Herschel Island, which sits off the northern Yukon coast in the Beaufort Sea. Herschel Island had its own history. It had been a significant whaling station in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a place where ships wintered and crews spent long months in the Arctic dark. By the 1930s it was quieter, but still a point of reference in the Western Arctic, a place people knew and moved through. The prospectors who spotted the Baychimo near there were not the kind of people easily given to dramatic storytelling. They were practical men in a practical landscape, looking for minerals, moving carefully through difficult terrain, and they saw the ship drifting and reported it. Each of these sightings had the same basic structure. Someone was somewhere in the Western Arctic doing something entirely unrelated to the Baychimo, and the ship appeared. It was never where anyone expected it to be. It was never stationary in a way that made it easy to reach or follow. It appeared, was seen, was sometimes boarded, and then moved on, carried by the ice and current into waters where the people who had seen it could not follow. The gaps between sightings were months, sometimes longer, and the distances between one sighting location and the next were often substantial. The ship was covering real ground, or rather the ice was carrying it across real ground, and the pattern of where it appeared was determined not by any logic a human observer could easily track, but by the slow, vast mechanics of the Beaufort Gaia, doing what it always did, indifferent to the small drama of the ship caught up in it. What people found when they boarded the Baychimo in these early years of its drifting was consistent enough across accounts to give a reasonably clear picture of the vessel's condition. The hull was holding. The ship was floating with what seemed like reasonable stability, not listing dramatically, not visibly taking on water in ways that suggested imminent sinking. The exterior was battered. Ice does not treat a steel hull gently, and the winters of 1931 and 1932 had left marks. There was rust. There was damage from ice pressure in places. But the fundamental structure was intact. Inside, it was colder than you might imagine a ship's interior being even in summer. With no heating and no insulation being maintained, the interior temperature tracked the exterior fairly closely, and the Arctic is not warm even in July. Everything was damp and cold and still. The ship's fittings, whatever had not been removed when the cargo was taken off, were deteriorating. Wood was warping, metal was corroding. The spaces that had once been occupied by crew members, where people had slept and eaten and worked, were empty in a way that went beyond just the absence of people. The personal objects, the small accumulated details of a working vessel with a living crew were gone. What remained was the shell, the structure of the ship without its human content. People who spent any real time aboard described it in ways that circled around the same quality. A ship that was physically present but somehow evacuated of the thing that makes a ship make sense, which is purpose. A ship without a destination, without cargo, without crew, without any of the forward motion that a vessel is built around. Just the form of a ship drifting. Some accounts use the word eerie. Others were more matter-of-fact about it. A deteriorating vessel in poor condition, still afloat. Location unknown to its previous owners. The emotional register depended entirely on who was doing the describing. The Inuit communities along the Alaskan and Canadian Arctic coastlines had a somewhat different relationship with the Baychimo's presence than the occasional trapper or prospector who stumbled across it. For communities that travelled these waters seasonally, the ship was becoming a known feature of the landscape, not in the sense of being predictable or locatable, but in the sense of being a thing that existed, a thing that had been seen, a thing that might be encountered again. Stories about it circulated. Elders knew about it. When a hunter came back and said he had seen the ship, people knew which ship he meant. The Baychimo had acquired a kind of presence in the local understanding of the region that was separate from its legal status as an abandoned commercial vessel or its coverage in distant newspapers. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The ship was simultaneously a newspaper story in Canadian and American cities, a curiosity, a strange tale from the far north, and a lived reality for people who actually moved through the waters it drifted in. For the newspaper readers, the Baychimo was something exotic and slightly unreal, a ghost ship story from a place most of them would never see. For the hunters and travellers of the Western Arctic, it was a real thing in a real landscape, something that had practical implications if you encountered it and needed shelter, something that fit into the ongoing experience of living and working in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. The same ship, the same story, but understood in completely different registers depending on where you were standing. By the mid-1930s, the Baychimo had been drifting for several years, and had accumulated enough sightings and enough press coverage that it was beginning to take on a genuine legendary quality. Not legendary in the sense of being doubted. The sightings were real, the people who reported them were credible, and the ship's existence was not in question. Legendary in the sense of being larger than its own facts. The Baychimo had become a story that people told not just to convey information, but because the story itself had a quality worth passing on. The strangeness of it, the persistence of it, the way it kept appearing when it should have been gone. This is the moment in many legends where the story starts to drift away from the facts, where details get added, where the thing becomes more dramatic or more supernatural in the retelling. What is interesting about the Baychimo is that this did not really happen, or at least not in the ways you might expect. The story did not need embellishment. The facts were already strange enough. A cargo ship, abandoned in 1931, still drifting in 1934, still being boarded by people who found it intact enough to shelter in, that is not a story that needs ghost lights or mysterious sounds or dramatic disappearances to be remarkable. The strangeness was already built into the basic reality of what was happening. The 1930s sightings established the pattern that would hold for the next 3 decades. The Baychimo would appear, be seen or boarded, and then vanish back into the ice and water of the Beaufort and Chukchi regions, only to surface again months or years later somewhere else. Each sighting was its own small event, a brief intersection between the ship's slow, involuntary journey and the lives of the people who happened to cross its path. And each sighting added another thread to the accumulating story of a vessel that simply refused to disappear. The Hudson's Bay Company, meanwhile, had not entirely given up on the ship. The cargo had been saved, but the vessel itself had real value, and the company was aware that the Baychimo was still out there, still afloat, still potentially recoverable if the right opportunity presented itself. The question of how to actually get the ship back, how to find it, reach it, and tow it out of Arctic waters that were only navigable for a few months each year, was a practical problem with no easy solution. But the sightings kept coming in, and each one renewed the question. The ship was there. It was real. It was theoretically reachable. The attempts to actually reach it and bring it back were another chapter entirely, and they would prove just as complicated and ultimately just as unsuccessful as the ship's own situation suggested they might be. So the Hudson's Bay Company did try. That is worth being clear about. The Baychimo was not simply written off and forgotten the moment it drifted away from Point Barrow. The company had a financial interest in the vessel, and beyond that, there was something almost professionally uncomfortable about a working ship belonging to a major commercial enterprise simply wandering around the Arctic on its own. It was not good for appearances. It was not good for the ledger, and in the early years at least, before the Baychimo had accumulated a decade of sightings and a ghost ship reputation, there was a reasonable expectation that it could be found and brought back. The first serious salvage attempt came in 1933, about 2 years after the abandonment. A crew was assembled and sent out with the specific goal of reaching the Baychimo, assessing its condition, and if possible, towing it back to a port where it could be repaired and returned to service. They found it. That part actually worked. The Baychimo was located, still afloat, and the salvage crew was able to reach it and board it. By this point, the ship had been drifting for roughly 2 years, and its condition reflected that there was deterioration, there was damage from ice contact, the interior had suffered from the freeze and thaw cycles of 2 Arctic winters, but the hull was holding. The ship was there. It was real. And for a moment it looked like the story might simply end with a successful recovery. It did not. The problem was the ice. The Arctic has a way of closing conversations it was not invited into, and the ice moved in before the salvage crew could get a tow line established in any practical sense. Towing a vessel of the Baychimo's size, over 1,300 tons of displacement, through open water is one thing. Doing it in a region where pack ice can shift and close within hours is something else entirely. The window the salvagers had was narrow and then it was gone. The ice came back, the conditions became impassable, and the crew had to abandon the attempt and leave. The Baychimo stayed. It was in retrospect a preview of how every subsequent attempt would go. The ship found, the ship tantalizingly close, and then the Arctic simply declining to cooperate. There is something almost absurd about this, if you let yourself see it that way. A company with real resources and real motivation, sending trained people with equipment specifically designed for this kind of work, and the ship just slips away again. Not through any drama, not through a storm that wrecks the salvage vessel or a sudden catastrophe. Just the ice doing what ice does, closing off the possibility before it fully opened. The Baychimo did not resist being caught in any active sense. It simply existed in an environment that made catching it extraordinarily difficult, and the environment kept winning. The 1930s brought a handful of other attempts, some more organised than others. There were years when the Hudson's Bay Company sent out inquiries based on the latest reported sighting, trying to calculate where the ship might be by the time a vessel could reach the area. This was genuinely difficult. A sighting reported in, say, August might reach company offices weeks later. By the time a response was organised, the ship could have drifted another 50 or 100 miles in any direction. The Beaufort Sea and the Chukchi Sea are not small bodies of water, and the ice drift patterns in the Western Arctic do not follow convenient schedules. The Baychimo moved according to the ice, and the ice moved according to wind and current systems that were not, in the 1930s, particularly well mapped or understood. By 1939, the Hudson's Bay Company made what appears to have been one of the more determined efforts of the decade. The timing matters. It was the last year before the war would change everything about what resources and attention could be directed toward a drifting cargo ship in the Arctic. The 1939 attempt was organised with the benefit of several years of sighting reports, which gave the salvagers a rough sense of the Baychimo's general drift pattern. The ship had been seen repeatedly in the waters between Point Barrow and the area around Herschel Island, moving in the loose circular patterns that characterise ice drift in that part of the Beaufort Sea. If you could position a salvage vessel in roughly the right area during the open water season, the thinking went you had a reasonable chance of an encounter. Whether the 1939 attempt actually located the ship is not entirely clear from the surviving records. Some accounts suggest the salvagers spotted the Baychimo, but could not reach it before conditions deteriorated. Others suggest the attempt was cut short by weather before any contact was made. What is consistent across accounts is the outcome. No recovery, no tow, no resolution. The ship remained free, if free is even the right word for something that had no say in its own movements. Part of what made recovery so difficult was the question of what you were actually recovering, and whether it was worth the effort by this point. The fur cargo, the thing that had given the Baychimo its commercial reason for existing on that final voyage, had been removed in 1931. Captain Cornwell's crew had airlifted it out before the abandonment, so the ship itself was what remained, and the ship was aging. By 1939 it was 25 years old. It had spent 8 of those years drifting without maintenance in one of the most punishing maritime environments on Earth. The steel hull, the mechanical systems, the interior fittings, all of it had been subjected to 8 Arctic winters, 8 cycles of freeze and thaw, 8 years of ice contact and saltwater exposure, and UV degradation, and the simple, slow entropy of a vessel that no one was looking after. The cost of a serious salvage operation in Arctic waters was not trivial. The season was short, the distances were large, the risks were real, and the outcome was uncertain. Against that cost, you had to weigh the value of what you would get back. A 25-year-old cargo vessel in unknown condition, requiring extensive repairs before it could work again, in an era when the economics of Arctic trading were themselves shifting. The calculus was not obviously favourable, and yet the attempts kept coming, at least for a while, partly because of the sunk cost of the ship's original value, and partly, one suspects, because there was something genuinely irritating about a vessel just being out there, unclaimed, unreachable, making the company look like it had simply lost track of a major piece of equipment. The practical challenges of towing deserve a bit more attention, because they help explain why even successful sightings so rarely turned into successful recoveries. A tow operation in open water requires a stable connection between the towing vessel and the towed vessel, enough power to move the load, and a clear path to a destination. In the Western Arctic, none of these conditions were reliable. The ice could close around a vessel within hours, making the tow line useless or dangerous. The path to any useful port from the Baychimo's usual drift zone was long. Point Barrow to Nome, for instance, is hundreds of miles, and the route passes through waters that can ice over without much warning. And the Baychimo itself, after years of drifting, may have had structural issues that made attaching a tow line complicated or risky. A hull that is sound enough to float is not necessarily sound enough to handle the stress of being pulled by another vessel through partially iced water. There is also a subtler problem. The Baychimo was not sitting still waiting to be collected. It was moving constantly with the ice. A salvage vessel approaching from one direction might find that the Baychimo had drifted several miles in the time it took to close the distance. Getting close enough to board was one thing. Getting close enough to establish a stable tow in conditions where both vessels were subject to ice movement was considerably harder. The people who attempted this were not incompetent. They were experienced Arctic mariners working in conditions that were genuinely, objectively difficult. The environment was the problem, not the people. What this series of failed attempts produced beyond frustration was a gradual shift in how the Baychimo was understood, at least in official and commercial terms. By the late 1930s, the Hudson's Bay Company's active interest in recovering the vessel seems to have cooled. The ship was still being reported, still being sighted, but the organised attempts to retrieve it became less frequent and eventually stopped. The Baychimo moved from being a recoverable asset to being something else. An anomaly, a story, a ship that existed in the record books as abandoned and in the waters of the Arctic as a drifting presence that no one was actively pursuing anymore. This shift happened quietly, without any formal declaration. There was no moment where someone at the Hudson's Bay Company said, officially, we are giving up on the Baychimo. It was more a gradual letting go, a slow withdrawal of attention and resources as the years passed, and each attempt either failed or was not made. The ship had been abandoned once, in 1931, as a practical decision under impossible conditions. By the late 1930s, it had been abandoned a second time, in a quieter and more final sense, released from the category of things being actively pursued, and allowed to simply be whatever it was going to be. And what it was going to be, as it turned out, was still there, still afloat, still drifting through the Beaufort and Chukchi seas on whatever course the ice and current chose for it. The failed salvage attempts had not changed that. The years of Arctic exposure had not changed that. The ship had a quality of persistence that did not seem to be diminished by either human effort or natural force. It had been abandoned, found, assessed as too damaged to survive, and left again, and it had kept floating. It had been approached by salvage crews who could not hold on to it, and it had kept drifting. It was, by any reasonable standard, supposed to be gone. The Arctic does not treat steel gently, and time does not stand still, and a vessel without maintenance is a vessel in slow decline. All of this was true. And yet the Baychimo kept showing up. The 1940s were coming, and with them a world that had larger things on its mind than a drifting cargo ship in the far north. The war would change the Arctic in ways that nobody had anticipated. More aircraft, more military infrastructure, more human presence in a region that had previously been one of the most isolated on Earth. More eyes, in other words. More chances to see something drifting alone in the ice. Whether that would make the Baychimo easier to find, or simply produce more sightings to add to the accumulating record of a ship that could be seen but never quite caught, was a question the next decade would begin to answer. The world went to war in September 1939, and the years that followed changed almost everything. The shape of nations, the movement of people, the purpose of distant and previously overlooked places. The Arctic was not exempt from this. Alaska, which had been a remote and lightly administered territory, suddenly became strategically significant. The Japanese occupied two of the Aleutian Islands in 1942, Attu and Kiska, and the United States responded with a substantial military build-up across Alaska. Airfields were constructed, supply lines were extended, military personnel moved through Anchorage, Fairbanks, Nome, and the coastal settlements in numbers that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. The Arctic, which had always been a place defined by its distance from everything else, found itself briefly close to the centre of things. None of this had anything to do with the Baychimo, of course. The ship did not know there was a war. It had no crew to be conscripted, no cargo to be requisitioned, no route to be reassigned. It simply kept doing what it had been doing since November 1931, drifting slowly through the pack ice of the Beaufort and Chukchi seas, following the rhythms of current and wind and seasonal freeze, indifferent to the world's upheaval. There is something almost comforting about that, in a strange way. While everything else was in violent motion, the Baychimo was just quietly out there, moving at the pace of ice. The 1942 sighting is one of the more notable ones from this period. The ship was spotted near Point Barrow, Alaska, which is notably very close to where it had been trapped and abandoned back in October and November of 1931. 11 years of drifting, and the Baychimo had found its way back to roughly the same stretch of coastline. This is not as strange as it might sound. The ice dynamics of the Western Arctic create patterns, circular, slow, seasonal patterns, that can carry objects through the same general regions repeatedly over the course of years. The Beaufort Gyre, a large clockwise circulation of ice and water in the Beaufort Sea, is the dominant force in this part of the Arctic, and it has a tendency to keep things moving within a certain geographic envelope, rather than carrying them off indefinitely in one direction. The Baychimo had not escaped the Arctic. It had been circulating within it, slowly, for over a decade. Who made the 1942 sighting, and in exactly what circumstances, is not entirely clear from the available record. This is a recurring feature of the Baychimo's history. Many of the sightings are documented in newspaper reports or second-hand accounts, and the details vary. What is consistent is the location, and the fact that the ship was still afloat, still recognisable, still the Baychimo. By 1942, the vessel was 28 years old, built in Hamburg in 1914, which means it had already been a working ship for 17 years before it was abandoned, and had then been drifting unmanned for another 11. For a steel-hulled cargo vessel in the Arctic, that is a significant age and a significant ordeal. And yet there it was, near Point Barrow, still floating. The wartime increase in Arctic activity did produce more eyes on the water, which is one reason why sightings during this period are somewhat better documented than they might otherwise have been. Military aircraft flew routes across Alaska and along the Arctic coast that civilian pilots had rarely used before. Supply ships moved through waters that had previously seen only occasional commercial traffic. The infrastructure of observation, the simple human density required to notice things, was greater in the early 1940s than it had been in the early 1930s. Whether this produced more actual sightings of the Baychimo, or simply better reporting of sightings that would otherwise have gone unrecorded, is hard to say. Probably both. There was a 1945 sighting as well near the end of the war. The ship was spotted again, still in the general region of the Western Arctic, still drifting. By this point, the Baychimo had been at sea without a crew for 14 years. Think about what that means in physical terms for a moment. 14 Arctic winters, 14 cycles of freeze and thaw, of ice building up against the hull and then retreating, of temperatures dropping to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit and then climbing back toward freezing in the brief summer. No one had painted the hull. No one had pumped out any water that seeped in. No one had checked the rivets or the seams or the condition of the steel. The ship had been entirely on its own, subject to one of the most demanding environments on the planet, and it was still there. The physical questions this raises are genuinely interesting. Steel corrodes. In salt water, it corrodes faster. In cold salt water, the process slows somewhat. Low temperatures reduce the rate of electrochemical reactions, but it does not stop. Over 14 years, the Baychimo's hull would have accumulated significant rust, particularly at and below the waterline. The question is whether that corrosion had compromised the hull's structural integrity enough to cause flooding, or whether the steel remained thick enough to hold. The fact that the ship was still floating in 1945 suggests that, at least in those areas visible to observers, it had not yet reached a critical failure point. But the interior condition was another matter, and no one who boarded the ship in the 1940s left a detailed written record of what they found. The Alaska native communities along the Arctic coast had a different relationship with the Baychimo than anyone else did. For the Inuit and Inupiat people who lived and worked in this region, the ship was not a mystery or a news story. It was a feature of the landscape, a known thing, something that appeared in certain waters at certain times, that could be used for shelter in a storm, that was recognisable and real even if its continued existence was unusual. Several accounts from this period suggest that Alaska native hunters and travellers had incorporated the Baychimo into their practical knowledge of the region. They knew roughly where it tended to appear. They knew it was habitable in a basic sense. They treated it with the matter-of-fact familiarity that people develop toward things they have encountered repeatedly over time. This is a dimension of the Baychimo's story that the newspaper accounts and official records tend to underrepresent. The ship's legend, as it developed in Canadian and American and British newspapers, was built around the drama of a ghost ship, the strangeness of an abandoned vessel that refused to sink. But for the communities closest to it, the Baychimo was less a ghost than a neighbour, an odd neighbour certainly, an absent one, but a familiar presence in a landscape that most of the world considered empty and featureless. The people who actually lived in that landscape knew it was neither. It is worth pausing on this for a moment, because it changes how you understand the sightings. When a newspaper in Toronto or London reported that the Baychimo had been spotted again, the tone was invariably one of wonder and mild disbelief, the ghost ship surfaces once more defying explanation. But when an Inupiat hunter encountered the ship and used it for shelter, or steered around it, or mentioned it to others in the community, the tone was almost certainly much more practical. Of course, the ship is still out there. It has been out there for years. Here is where I saw it. Here is what the ice was doing. Here is how long I stayed aboard. The Baychimo existed simultaneously in two very different registers, as a romantic mystery for people far away and as a mundane reality for people nearby. The wartime years also raise an interesting counterfactual. The military build-up in Alaska included significant sonar and aerial survey capability, technology that, in principle, could have been used to locate and track a drifting vessel. But of course, no one was looking for the Baychimo with military resources. The war had other priorities. The ship was a commercial anomaly, not a strategic concern. It drifted through the expanded human presence of wartime Alaska, largely unnoticed by the institutions that now had the capability to find it, because those institutions had no particular reason to look. By the time the war ended in 1945, the Baychimo had been drifting for 14 years. The Hudson's Bay Company's active interest in recovering the vessel had essentially ended years earlier. The ship existed now primarily as a story, something that people in Arctic communities knew about, something that occasionally made the newspapers, something that sailors and hunters mentioned when they had encountered it. It had passed out of the category of commercial concern and into the category of legend, though it was a legend with a physical reality, a legend you could actually board and stand on and shelter inside. The post-war years brought their own changes to the Arctic. The Cold War made Alaska strategically important in a new way, this time as a frontier facing the Soviet Union across the Bering Strait. Radar installations were built. The DEW line, the Distant Early Warning System, stretched across the northern coast of Alaska and Canada. More infrastructure, more personnel, more activity in a region that had historically seen very little of any of these things. The Western Arctic was becoming, slowly and partially, a more connected place. Through all of this, the Baychimo kept drifting. The 1940s gave way to the 1950s, and the ship had now been at sea without a crew for nearly 2 decades. The sightings continued, though they were becoming somewhat less frequent, or perhaps more accurately, the record of them becomes somewhat less complete as the immediate post-war years passed and the ship faded slightly from public attention. The war had briefly increased awareness of Arctic activity. As that awareness settled back toward its normal level, the Baychimo became again what it had been before, a story that surfaced periodically, then went quiet, then surfaced again. What is striking about the 1940s as a chapter in the Baychimo's long second life is the contrast between the scale of what was happening in the world and the absolute indifference of the ship to all of it. The Second World War reshaped the political map of the planet. It killed tens of millions of people. It produced technological changes, radar, jet engines, nuclear weapons, that transformed what was possible. And through all of it, a 1,322-ton cargo vessel, built in Hamburg in 1914, drifted quietly through the Beaufort Sea, accumulating rust and years, appearing occasionally to hunters and pilots, and then disappearing again into the ice. There is no grand meaning to draw from that. It is just a fact, and a slightly strange one. The Baychimo did not represent anything about the war, or about human resilience, or about the indifference of nature to human affairs. It was a ship. It floated. The world changed around it, and it kept floating. That is all. But there is something in the plainness of that fact that makes it oddly memorable. By the late 1940s, the ship had been drifting for close to 2 decades. The people who had been aboard it in the early years of its abandonment, the Inuit hunters who had sheltered inside it in 1932, the trapper Leslie Melvin who had explored it in 1933, were now years older, and the ship they had boarded was years more weathered. The interior that had been merely deteriorating in 1932 would have been considerably more deteriorated by 1948. The hull that had been battered but sound in 1931 had endured 17 more Arctic winters since then. The ship was aging. That was undeniable. The question was how much longer it could continue. The 1950s would bring the Baychimo back into wider public attention. A new round of documentation, a new boarding, new accounts of what the ship looked like after more than 20 years of solitary drifting. The story was not over. Not even close. The Baychimo still had years ahead of it, and the people who would encounter it in the coming decade would find something that was at once more deteriorated and more extraordinary than anything the 1940s had produced. A ship that had now outlasted the reasonable expectations of everyone who had ever known it, and that showed no obvious signs of being finished. The 1950s arrived with a particular kind of quiet momentum for the Baychimo. The ship had been drifting for more than 20 years by then, and in that time the world had changed considerably, but the Arctic, as it tends to do, had changed rather less. The pack ice still moved in its slow circular patterns through the Beaufort and Chukchi seas. The season still narrowed the window for navigation down to a few careful months each summer. The communities along the Alaskan and Canadian Arctic coastlines still lived in close relationship with that ice, reading it and moving with it the way people in other places read weather or road conditions. And somewhere out in all of that, the Baychimo was still there, still floating, still appearing occasionally to people who happened to be in the right stretch of water at the right time. What changed in the 1950s was the attention. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the ship had been drifting long enough by then that it had started to accumulate a kind of institutional recognition. Newspapers in Canada, the United Kingdom and the United States had been covering the Baychimo periodically since the early 1930s, usually when a new sighting came in and gave editors a reason to run the story again. By the 1950s, those stories had a different quality to them. They were no longer just reporting a strange event. They were revisiting a legend that had now been in progress for 2 decades. The framing had shifted from a ship has been found drifting to the famous ghost ship has been seen again. That is a meaningful difference. It meant the Baychimo had crossed some threshold in the public imagination from anomaly to institution. The newspaper coverage from this period is worth pausing on for a moment, because it tells you something about how the story was being understood outside the Arctic. The articles tended to emphasise the mystery, the ghostliness, the improbability. They used phrases like the wandering ship and the phantom of the Arctic. They marvelled at the duration of the drift. They speculated, sometimes wildly, about what the ship might look like inside after so many years alone, and they almost always ended with some version of the same question: how is it still floating? That question had a real answer. Pack ice dynamics, hull construction, buoyancy, the specific geography of the Western Arctic. But the newspaper version of the story preferred to leave it as a mystery, because a mystery was more interesting to readers who were not sailors or Arctic geographers. The Baychimo was better as a ghost than as a physics problem. In the communities closer to the ship's actual range, the understanding was more textured. Among Inuit and other Alaska Native communities along the northern coast, the Baychimo was not exactly a mystery in the way newspaper readers experienced it. It was more like a known feature of the landscape. Unusual, yes, but known. People had encountered it. People had boarded it. People had stories about it that circulated through communities in the way that practical knowledge circulates. Not as legend exactly, but as information. Where was it last seen? What direction was the ice moving? Whether it looked like it was sitting higher or lower in the water than before. This was useful knowledge for hunters and travellers in the region, and it was passed along in that spirit. The 1956 boarding is the most documented encounter from this decade, and it is worth describing in some detail because it gives us the clearest picture we have of what the Baychimo looked like after 25 years of solitary drifting. A group, the exact composition of which varies slightly depending on the source, but which included several people familiar with Arctic travel, reached the ship and spent several days aboard it. This was not a quick sighting from a distance. They were on the ship. They moved through it. They had time to look carefully at what 25 years of Arctic weather had done to a steel cargo vessel, with no one to maintain it. What they found was, depending on how you look at it, either encouraging or unsettling. The hull was still intact enough to keep the ship afloat. That much was undeniable since the ship was plainly floating. But the condition of the vessel had deteriorated significantly from what early visitors in the 1930s had described. The interior was in a state that one account describes as advanced decay. Woodwork that had survived the first decade of abandonment had not survived the second. Anything organic, ropes, fabric, wooden fittings, the remains of anything that had been left aboard, had been subjected to freeze-thaw cycles year after year, and the cumulative effect was considerable. The ship smelled of rust and cold and something older, the particular smell of a space that has been sealed and opened and sealed again many times over many years. The metal itself was in better shape than the organic materials, which is what you would expect. Steel corrodes slowly in cold salt water, slower than in warmer water actually, because the chemical reactions that drive corrosion proceed more slowly at low temperatures. The hull had rust certainly, and there were areas of concern. But the basic structural integrity of the ship was apparently still sufficient to keep it afloat. This is one of those details that sounds almost impossible until you think about the physics of it. A steel hull does not need to be in good condition to float. It needs to be watertight enough that the interior remains mostly air, and the air provides buoyancy. As long as the hull is not taking on water faster than it can be compensated for, the ship will float. The Baychimo's hull, despite 25 years of Arctic abuse, was apparently still meeting that basic requirement. The 1956 visitors also noted the ship's position and general drift pattern, which had by this point become somewhat predictable to people who knew the region well. The Baychimo tended to move within a relatively defined area of the Western Arctic, the Beaufort Sea and the waters around the northern Alaskan coast. It did not drift endlessly outward. The circular current patterns of the Beaufort Gyre, which is the large clockwise circulation of water and ice in the Western Arctic, tended to keep things within a certain range rather than carrying them away indefinitely. The Baychimo was, in a sense, caught in a slow loop. It drifted, but it drifted within a bounded region, which is part of why it kept being found by people in roughly the same part of the world, rather than turning up somewhere completely unexpected. The legal situation of the ship was, by the 1950s, genuinely murky. Maritime law has clear principles about abandoned vessels, but applying those principles to a ship that had been drifting unmanned for 25 years in international and contested Arctic waters was not straightforward. The Hudson's Bay Company had officially abandoned the Baychimo in 1931 after removing the cargo. Under maritime law, an abandoned vessel can be claimed by whoever finds it, but claiming a vessel and actually taking possession of it are different things, and no one had managed to take possession of the Baychimo in any meaningful legal sense. Every boarding had been temporary, every salvage attempt had failed. The ship had never been towed to port, never been registered under a new name, never been formally transferred to a new owner. This created an odd situation where the Baychimo existed as a kind of legal ghost alongside its physical one. It was property with no clear owner. It was a vessel with no flag. It had been built in Germany, registered in Britain, operated by a Canadian company, and was now drifting through Alaskan and Canadian Arctic waters with no one responsible for it. The question of who would be liable if the ship caused an accident, if it collided with another vessel, for instance, or blocked a navigation channel, was one that no one seemed eager to answer. In practice, the ship was simply left to do what it had been doing: drift. The legal ambiguity was never resolved, because resolving it would have required either finding the ship and physically claiming it, or formally declaring it a total loss and removing it from the maritime record. Neither happened. There is something almost philosophical about that legal situation, if you are in the mood for it. The Baychimo had outlasted the frameworks that were supposed to apply to it. Maritime law assumes that ships are either in service or wrecked or claimed. The Baychimo was none of those things. It was simply out there, operating by its own rules, which mostly consisted of floating and drifting and occasionally allowing people to board it for a few days before disappearing back into the ice. The law had no good category for this, and so the law mostly looked the other way. The growing mythology around the ship in this period is worth acknowledging separately from the practical and legal dimensions, because it was real and it had its own effects. Stories circulated about the Baychimo that were not exactly accurate. Embellishments, elaborations, details that had drifted away from the documented record the way the ship itself drifted from its last known position. Some accounts gave the ship supernatural qualities, the ability to appear and vanish at will, a kind of intentionality to its movements, a sense that it was somehow choosing to remain free. These stories were more common in the popular press than in the accounts of people who had actually encountered the vessel, who tended to be more matter-of-fact about it. But the mythology existed alongside the reality, and in some ways the mythology was more durable. People who had never been anywhere near the Arctic had an image of the Baychimo as something uncanny, something that defied natural explanation, something that belonged more to folklore than to maritime history. The reality was stranger in its own way, precisely because it did have a natural explanation. The Baychimo was not supernatural. It was a steel ship in a cold sea with a particular set of physical properties that happened to allow it to keep floating longer than anyone expected. The strangeness was not in the mechanism. The mechanism was just physics, but in the duration, and in the accumulation of encounters, and in the way the ship had woven itself into the lives of so many different people across so many years. A ghost ship that was actually supernatural would be interesting in one way. A ghost ship that was entirely real, entirely physical, and still managed to behave like a ghost for 38 years is interesting in a different and arguably more compelling way. The Baychimo was the second kind. By the end of the 1950s, the ship had been drifting for nearly 30 years. The people who had first abandoned it in 1931, Captain John Cornwell, the 14 men who had stayed behind on the ice, the crew who had been airlifted out, were significantly older now, or gone. The Hudson's Bay Company had moved on to other concerns. The fur trade that the Baychimo had been built to serve had changed considerably. The Arctic itself was changing slowly in ways that would accelerate in the decades to come, and the Baychimo kept drifting through all of it, accumulating years the way it accumulated rust, quietly, steadily, without announcement. The 1960s would be the ship's final confirmed decade. The sightings became less frequent, the documentation thinner, the encounters harder to verify. The ship was aging in ways that even Arctic cold could no longer slow indefinitely, but it was not finished yet. There were still years of drifting ahead, still encounters to come, still one final confirmed sighting waiting at the end of the decade. A last appearance that would close the documented record of the Baychimo's long, improbable second life, though it would close it without explanation, without drama, and without anything that looked like an ending. That final sighting came in 1969, 38 years after Captain Cornwell and his men had stood on the ice near Point Barrow and watched the blizzard swallow their ship whole. A group of Inuit hunters encountered the Baychimo in the Beaufort Sea. She was still there, still floating, still alone. The details of this sighting are not exhaustive. It was not a formal survey, not a scientific expedition, not a salvage attempt with a paper trail. It was hunters, moving through the ice in the way that people in that part of the world had always moved through it, and they came across a ship. The same ship that had been appearing and disappearing in these waters since before some of them were born. They recognized it, or they recognized it from descriptions passed down through communities that had been watching the Baychimo drift through their landscape for nearly 4 decades. The ship was still afloat. That is the most important thing. In 1969, after 38 years without a crew, without maintenance, without anyone pumping bilge water or patching hull plates or doing any of the 1,000 small tasks that keep a working vessel from becoming a sunken one, the Baychimo was still on the surface of the water. The condition of the ship by this point would have been severe. There is no detailed written account of what the hunters found when they looked at her up close, the way there was for some of the earlier boardings. The 1956 group that spent days aboard and described the interior in some detail, or Leslie Melvin in 1933 who explored her room by room. What we know from 1969 is that she was seen, that she was identified, and that she was floating in the Beaufort Sea. The location was consistent with the general drift pattern the ship had been following for years. That slow, circling movement through the Western Arctic that had been carrying her back and forth across roughly the same stretch of water since the early 1930s. She had not drifted to Siberia. She had not somehow ended up in the North Atlantic. She was where she had always been, more or less, in the cold grey water between Alaska and the permanent ice pack. Think about what it means for a ship to be 55 years old in 1969. The Baychimo was built in 1914. She was launched into service in an era before the First World War had ended, when Hamburg was still the centre of a confident German shipbuilding industry, when the Hudson's Bay Company's Arctic trading routes were a going concern rather than a historical footnote. By 1969, the world had passed through 2 world wars, the invention of radar and jet aircraft and nuclear weapons, the beginning of the space age. Apollo 11 landed on the moon in July of 1969, the same year as the Baychimo's final confirmed sighting. A ship built in the age of coal and empire was still floating in the Arctic, while human beings were walking on the surface of another world. There is something quietly disorienting about that, if you let yourself sit with it for a moment. And 38 of those 55 years had been spent without a crew. More than 2/3 of the ship's entire existence had been as a drifting, unmanned vessel. The Baychimo had spent longer as a ghost ship than it had spent as a working one. The years of active service, 1921 to 1931, a decade of fur trade runs along the Alaskan and Canadian Arctic coast, were now a smaller fraction of the ship's total history than the years of drifting. Whatever the Baychimo was, by 1969 it was more ghost than ship in the proportional sense, even if it was still physically real, still made of steel, still displacing water. After 1969 there is nothing confirmed, no verified sighting, no boarding, no documented encounter. The Baychimo had been seen irregularly but consistently across the previous decades. There were gaps of a few years between some sightings, which was not unusual given how vast and how empty the Beaufort Sea is, and how rarely anyone was out there looking. But the gap after 1969 is different. It kept growing. A year became 5 years, 5 years became 10, 10 became 20. No one who could be verified, No account that could be cross-referenced, no photograph or log entry or radio report that placed the Baychimo anywhere in the world after that final encounter in the Beaufort Sea. The ship had been appearing and disappearing for 38 years, and then it simply stopped appearing. This is not a dramatic ending. There was no distress signal, no reported sinking, no Coast Guard report of wreckage found. No one watched the Baychimo go down. No one found the hull split open on a shoal or discovered the mast poking up through shallow water. The ship was there in 1969, and then the record goes quiet, and that quiet never ended. The Baychimo's story closes not with a period, but with an ellipsis. Not a conclusion, but a trailing off, the way a voice fades at the edge of hearing rather than stopping cleanly. There is something fitting about that, in a way that is hard to articulate without sounding like you are reaching for meaning where there may not be any. But the Baychimo had always been a ship that refused to behave the way ships were supposed to behave. It refused to sink when it should have sunk. It refused to stay where it was left. It refused to be caught when people tried to catch it. It refused to become a clean historical fact. And in the end, it refused to provide a tidy ending. It just stopped being found. Whether that means it sank, or grounded, or is still locked in ice somewhere north of the Alaskan coast, no one can say with certainty. The ship extended its pattern of elusiveness right to the very last. What the 1969 sighting does, beyond simply closing the documented record, is fix a kind of final image of the Baychimo in the mind. A group of hunters in the Beaufort Sea, the ice around them, the cold grey sky above and there. A ship, old, battered, sitting lower in the water than she once did, rust streaking her sides, no lights, no smoke from any funnel, no sound of engines, just a ship, floating. The same ship that had been floating there, more or less, since before those hunters were born. They would have known the story. Everyone in Arctic communities along the Alaskan coast knew the story of the Baychimo by 1969. The ship had been part of the landscape of those communities for longer than a generation, and here it was again, one more time, doing what it had always done, drifting, alone, persistent, real. It is worth pausing on the word persistent because that is really the quality that defines the Baychimo above all others. Not mysterious exactly. The ship's survival had a physical explanation, even if that explanation involved an unusual combination of circumstances. Not supernatural. No one who actually boarded the vessel described anything that could not be accounted for by ordinary physics, but persistent, stubbornly, improbably, almost absurdly persistent. The Arctic is a place that destroys things. It destroys wood and metal and rubber and plastic. It destroys ships that are actively crewed and maintained. It destroys expeditions with experienced leaders and full supplies. It is one of the most hostile environments on Earth for any kind of machinery or structure. And the Baychimo sat in the middle of that environment for 38 years and kept floating. That persistence is what the 1969 sighting represents, in its quiet way. One more year, one more winter survived. One more appearance in the record before the record ends. The hunters who saw the ship in 1969 were the last people to confirm they had seen it. Their account passed into the same stream of oral and documented history that had been collecting Baychimo sightings since 1932. And then there were no more sightings to add. The stream simply stopped receiving new water. The Baychimo had made its final appearance in the world of human record, and it had done so not with fanfare, not with drama, not with anything that looked like a conclusion, just a ship in the ice, seen by hunters, noted, and then gone. There is a question that this final sighting raises, and it is not a small one. If the Baychimo was still afloat in 1969, what happened in the years immediately after? The ship had survived 38 Arctic winters. It had been through conditions that should have destroyed it many times over. But materials do not last forever, and steel in salt water corrodes even in the cold, and ice pressure accumulates, and at some point the hull that had been holding back the sea for decades would have reached its limit. The question is not whether the Baychimo eventually succumbed. It almost certainly did, but when and where and what that looked like when it happened. No one was there to see it. That much seems clear. If someone had witnessed the Baychimo finally going down, that account would almost certainly have made it into the record. The ship was famous enough by 1969 that its sinking would have been news. The most likely scenario is that the ship sank quietly in a remote stretch of water with no one nearby, which is consistent with how it had spent most of its unmanned life. The Beaufort Sea is large and most of it is not under observation at any given time, and a ship sinking in the middle of it in the 1970s, or the 1980s, or even later, could have happened without anyone knowing. The cold water would have slowed the corrosion but not stopped it. The ice pressure accumulating over decades would have eventually found a weakness, and then, at some point, the hull would have given way, and the water would have come in, and the Baychimo would have settled toward the seafloor. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the ship is still there, locked in ice, preserved by the same cold that should have destroyed it. The Arctic has preserved stranger things. There are mammoths in the permafrost of Siberia with their fur still intact. There are ships from the 19th century that have been found on the Arctic seafloor in remarkable condition, the cold water having slowed the biological processes that break down organic material in warmer seas. Steel corrodes faster than wood in some conditions, but in very cold, low-oxygen water, the rates slow considerably. It is not impossible, it is genuinely not impossible, that some portion of the Baychimo still exists somewhere in the Western Arctic, either on the seafloor or grounded on a remote coastline or still caught in ice. The 2006 search, which will be covered in more detail shortly, found nothing conclusive, but the search area was necessarily limited, and the Beaufort Sea is deep in places and shallow in others, and the technology available in 2006, while sophisticated, was not unlimited in its reach. The absence of a confirmed wreck does not mean the wreck does not exist. It means it has not been found. Those are different things, and in the context of the Baychimo's history, the distinction feels important. The ship spent 38 years being present, but not found. It would be almost appropriate if it continued that pattern in its final resting state, present somewhere, just not yet located. What the 1969 sighting leaves behind is not a solved mystery or a closed chapter. It leaves behind a last data point in a long series of data points, and then silence. The ship had been generating data, sightings, boardings, attempted salvages, newspaper stories, oral accounts, since 1931, and then the data simply stopped. The Baychimo was last confirmed in the Beaufort Sea in 1969, and after that, nothing. The world kept turning. The Arctic kept freezing and thawing, and the Baychimo, whatever became of it, passed out of the human record without ceremony. There is a particular kind of ending, or non-ending, that feels more honest than a dramatic conclusion. The Baychimo story is one of those. It does not end with a bang, or a wreck, or a discovery. It ends with hunters seeing a ship in the ice, and then the ice closing back in, and the ship not being seen again. That is all. After 38 years of appearances and disappearances, the final disappearance simply turned out to be permanent, or at least permanent so far. Because the search for the Baychimo did not end in 1969. The ship's disappearance from the sighting record was not the same as the world losing interest in it. Quite the opposite. The mystery of what finally happened to the vessel, combined with the remarkable documented record of its survival, made it an enduring subject of curiosity for maritime historians, Arctic researchers, and the communities that had lived alongside its drifting presence for decades. The question of where the Baychimo went and what remains of it would eventually prompt a formal, organised search effort, one that brought modern technology to bear on a mystery that had been quietly accumulating for most of the 20th century. So if the Baychimo is gone, and it almost certainly is in some form, the question that remains is a practical one, and also a strangely philosophical one. What actually happened to it? Not in the vague sense of things wearing out and disappearing, but in the specific physical sense. Where did the hull fail? When did the water come in? What does the end of a ship like this actually look like, when no one is there to see it? There are a few serious possibilities, and none of them can be ruled out entirely. Each one is consistent with what we know about the ship, the environment, and the absence of any confirmed wreckage. They are not equally likely, but they are all genuinely plausible. And the fact that 3 distinct theories can each claim a reasonable foothold in the evidence tells you something about how little we actually know. The most straightforward explanation is also the most expected one. At some point after 1969, the hull simply failed. Steel corrodes, welds weaken. Riveted seams, which the Baychimo would have had given its 1914 construction, are vulnerable to the slow creep of metal fatigue and oxidation. In cold Arctic saltwater, corrosion happens more slowly than in warmer seas. The low temperature reduces the electrochemical activity that drives the process, but it does not stop. Over decades, even slowed corrosion accumulates. A ship that went into the water in 1914 and was abandoned in 1931 would have been receiving no maintenance, no repainting of protective coatings, no inspection of its seams or rivets for nearly 40 years by the time of the last sighting. That is an extraordinary amount of deferred deterioration. At some point, the hull would have developed a breach, possibly a small one at first, a slow leak that the ship's empty interior gradually filled. And then, once flooding began in earnest, the end would have come relatively quickly. A steel-hulled vessel taking on water does not drift indefinitely. It settles. It lists. And then it goes down. If this is what happened, the Baychimo is somewhere on the floor of the Beaufort Sea, or possibly the Chukchi Sea, depending on where it drifted in its final years. The depth in these regions varies considerably. Parts of the Beaufort Sea are quite shallow, less than 50 metres in some near-shore areas, while the deeper offshore sections can reach several hundred metres or more. A ship resting on a shallow sea floor in cold, low-oxygen Arctic water might be in surprisingly good condition even now, decades after sinking. The same conditions that slow corrosion above the waterline also apply below it, perhaps even more so. There are 19th century wooden ships on the Arctic seafloor that have been found largely intact, their timbers preserved by the cold and the near absence of wood-boring organisms that would demolish a hull in warmer waters. Steel behaves differently than wood, but the principle holds. Cold, dark, low-oxygen environments are unusually preserving. If the Baychimo sank in relatively shallow water and landed upright on a flat bottom, there is a real possibility that a significant portion of it still exists as a recognisable structure. That is not wishful thinking. That is just what we know about cold water preservation. The second theory is stranger, and harder to dismiss than you might expect. Some researchers and Arctic specialists have suggested that the Baychimo may never have sunk at all, that it became permanently locked in ice at some point and remains entombed there, frozen into a floe or a pressure ridge in a remote part of the Western Arctic. This sounds improbable, but the Arctic has a documented history of preserving things in ice for extraordinary lengths of time. The permafrost of the region has yielded intact woolly mammoths, ancient plant material and artifacts thousands of years old. Sea ice is not the same as permafrost, but multi-year Arctic sea ice, the thick, dense ice that persists year-round rather than melting each summer, can accumulate in layers and become remarkably solid over time. A ship caught in the right configuration of ice, in a location where the ice does not seasonally melt, could theoretically remain suspended within it for a very long time. The Baychimo had already demonstrated a tendency to be held and released by ice over its decades of drifting. The question is whether at some point it was held and not released, whether the ice that caught it one final time simply never let go. This theory is difficult to verify or disprove. Multi-year Arctic sea ice is not static. It moves, it fractures, it is influenced by wind and ocean currents, and increasingly by the warming temperatures that have dramatically reduced the extent of perennial Arctic ice since the mid-20th century. If the Baychimo was locked in multi-year ice in the 1970s, that ice has almost certainly changed configuration many times since then. The warming of the Arctic over the past several decades has been dramatic and well documented. Summer sea ice extent has declined by roughly 40% since satellite records began in the late 1970s. Ice that was once perennial has become seasonal in many areas. If the Baychimo was held in ice that has since melted out, the ship would have been released and either sank when it was, or resumed drifting, or grounded somewhere. None of those outcomes would necessarily have produced a sighting, since the areas involved are remote and not regularly travelled. But the ice entombment theory, in its pure form, ship still frozen somewhere in a stable ice mass, becomes harder to sustain as Arctic ice continues to retreat. If it were still locked in ice that has since thinned and broken, the ship would have been released at some point, and its fate after that release is unknown. The third theory is the one that maritime historians and search teams have found perhaps most intriguing from a practical standpoint. The Baychimo may have grounded, run aground on a shoal, a sandbar, a shallow coastal shelf, or a rocky outcropping somewhere along the Arctic coastline. The western Arctic coast of Alaska and the Yukon is not a smooth, featureless shore. It is irregular, with shallow nearshore waters, barrier islands, sandbars and gravel spits that extend into the sea in unexpected places. A drifting ship with no one aboard to steer it away from hazards would have had no mechanism for avoiding these features. If the Baychimo drifted into shallow water at the wrong angle and touched bottom, it might have settled onto a gravel bar or shallow reef and simply stayed there. Grounding does not necessarily mean immediate destruction. A ship that grounds gently on a soft bottom can remain structurally intact for a long time, depending on wave action and the nature of the substrate. In a sheltered location, behind a barrier island in a protected bay, in an area with limited wave energy, a grounded steel hull could persist for decades without being completely destroyed. What makes this theory particularly interesting is the geography of the search area. The Alaska Native coastal communities along the Chukchi and Beaufort seacoasts have extensive knowledge of local waters, shallows, and unusual features in the landscape. The 2006 search effort, which drew on interviews with Alaska Native elders, was partly motivated by the possibility that someone in those communities might have knowledge, either direct or passed down, of a grounded vessel in a remote location. The oral traditions of these communities are detailed and geographically specific, in ways that formal Western records often are not. The Baychimo had been part of the living landscape of these communities for decades, and it is possible that knowledge of its final resting place exists somewhere in that oral record, even if it has not been formally documented or connected to the ship's story. There is also the question of what we know about steel corrosion rates in the specific conditions of the Arctic. This is not a simple calculation. The rate at which steel corrodes in seawater depends on temperature, salinity, oxygen content, the presence of certain bacteria, and the specific composition of the steel itself. Cold water slows the process but does not halt it. A steel hull from 1914, built to the standards of that era, which were robust but not equivalent to modern marine-grade steel, would have been corroding continuously since the ship entered service, and accelerating in its deterioration after maintenance ceased in 1931. By 1969, the hull had been without any protective treatment for 38 years. By the time of any theoretical sinking in the 1970s or 1980s, that number would have been even higher. The structural integrity of the ship at that point is genuinely uncertain. It might have been more fragile than its floating appearance suggested, or it might have been holding together better than expected, in the way that cold water preservation sometimes allows. The honest answer is that we do not know, and without access to the hull itself, we cannot calculate it precisely. What we do know is that no confirmed wreckage has been found. This is the central fact that keeps all three theories alive. If the Baychimo had sunk in a known location in shallow water, there is a reasonable chance that sonar surveys or aerial observation would have detected it by now. The fact that nothing has been definitively identified suggests either that the ship is in deep water or in a location that has not been searched, or that whatever remains of it is buried under sediment or ice and not producing a clear sonar return. Sediment accumulation in Arctic coastal areas can be significant over decades, particularly in areas with high sediment load from rivers. A hull that sank close to the coast in the 1970s could, by now, be partially or largely buried under accumulated sediment, which would make it much harder to detect from the surface. It is also worth noting that the Beaufort Sea is genuinely large, and the search efforts that have been conducted have necessarily focused on the most probable areas based on the ship's known drift patterns and the 1969 sighting location. The Baychimo's drift was not random in the sense of being completely unpredictable. It followed the general circulation patterns of the Western Arctic, which tend to move in a broad counterclockwise gyre in the Beaufort Sea and along the Alaskan coast. But within that general pattern, the ship's specific position at any given time was influenced by local winds, seasonal ice conditions, and the particular configuration of ice in any given year. Extrapolating from the 1969 sighting to a probable final location involves significant uncertainty. The ship could have moved considerably from that position before its end, and in a direction that was not anticipated. There is something quietly unsettling about the fact that a ship as well documented as the Baychimo, a vessel with dozens of confirmed sightings over nearly 4 decades, covered by newspapers, searched for by salvagers, boarded by hunters and trappers and prospectors, could simply disappear without leaving a trace that modern technology has been able to confirm. It is a reminder that the Arctic is genuinely vast, and that vastness is not just a poetic observation, it is a physical reality with practical consequences for anyone trying to find something in it. The ocean floor in the Western Arctic has not been comprehensively mapped at the resolution needed to identify a ship-sized object. Large portions of it remain effectively unsurveyed at any meaningful detail. The ship could be down there, in whatever condition decades of cold water submersion have left it, and simply not yet within the reach of any search that has been conducted. None of these theories resolve the mystery. They describe the space of possibilities rather than collapsing it into a single answer. Hull failure and sinking, permanent ice entrapment, grounding on a remote coastline. Each one is consistent with the known facts, and none of them can be confirmed or eliminated without finding the ship. The Baychimo spent 38 years being present but elusive. In its final state, whatever that is, it has continued that pattern with remarkable consistency. The ship that refused to be caught when it was drifting has also so far refused to be found when it is still. That persistence, whether you call it luck or physics or something more poetic, is entirely in keeping with the character of the vessel as the record has described it. A ship that spent decades slipping away from salvagers and storms and ice pressure, and the general expectation that it should have sunk long ago is not going to give up its final location easily. And so the search in various forms has continued, including one formal, organised effort that brought the question of the Baychimo's whereabouts into the 21st century and into the halls of government. That formal, organised effort came in 2006, and it is worth pausing on it for a moment, because it represents something genuinely unusual in the history of this story. For most of the Baychimo's long drift, the interest in finding the ship was commercial or practical or personal. Salvagers who wanted to reclaim the vessel, hunters who stumbled across it by chance, trappers who boarded it out of curiosity. The 2006 effort was different. It was institutional, it was deliberate, and it was initiated not by a shipping company or a private salvage operation, but by a government. The Alaska State Legislature passed a resolution that year directing a formal search for the Baychimo. The resolution acknowledged the ship's history, recognised its significance to Alaska's maritime heritage, and called for a coordinated effort to determine what had become of it. This was not a minor administrative footnote, it was a documented legislative act, which means the state of Alaska in 2006 officially decided that finding this ship mattered enough to put resources behind the question. That is a remarkable thing when you think about it. The Baychimo had been missing in practical terms for nearly 4 decades by that point. The last confirmed sighting was in 1969. Anyone who had seen the ship in person was elderly, and many of them had passed away. And yet the ship's story had retained enough cultural weight, enough presence in Alaska's collective memory, that the legislature decided it deserved a real answer. The agencies involved in the search included the Alaska State Historic Preservation Office, which had been tracking the Baychimo as part of its broader work on maritime heritage sites in Alaskan waters. The search was not a single dramatic expedition. It was a methodological effort that combined several different approaches because the people organising it understood that finding a ship that had been missing for decades in one of the most remote stretches of ocean on Earth was not going to be accomplished by simply sailing out and looking around. One of the primary tools was archival research. The team went back through historical records, logbooks, newspaper accounts, Hudson's Bay Company documents, government reports, personal correspondence, to build the most complete possible picture of the Baychimo's known drift path. Every confirmed sighting was plotted. Every reported location was cross-referenced against the date, the ice conditions that year, and the prevailing currents. The goal was to construct a probabilistic map of where the ship might have travelled after the 1969 sighting, based on what was known about its behaviour over the previous decades. This is painstaking work, the kind that requires patience and a tolerance for uncertainty, because the data is fragmentary and the variables are many. The archival research alone took considerable time. The Baychimo's movements were documented in a patchwork of sources, none of them comprehensive, many of them imprecise about exact coordinates. A hunter who reported seeing the ship in 1942 near Point Barrow was not necessarily recording a GPS position. He was describing a location in the language of a person who knew that coastline by experience, not by instrument. Translating those descriptions into coordinates that could be used for a modern search required careful interpretation and a good deal of judgment about what the historical witnesses were actually describing. The team working on the archival side of the search had to be historians as much as navigators. Alongside the archival work, the search team conducted interviews with Alaska Native elders who had personal or community knowledge of the Baychimo. This was perhaps the most important and most irreplaceable part of the effort. The Alaska Native communities along the Beaufort and Chukchi coastlines had been living alongside the Baychimo's drift for decades. The ship had been part of their world in a way that it was not part of anyone else's. Inuit and Inupiaq hunters had encountered the vessel repeatedly across the years, had sheltered in it, had reported its position to others, had incorporated it into their navigational knowledge of the region. Some of that knowledge had been passed down through families and communities, surviving in oral form long after the individuals who had direct contact with the ship were gone. The interviews were conducted with care, because oral historical knowledge of this kind is not always easy to translate into the coordinates and dates that a formal search requires. A person who knows that their grandfather encountered the Baychimo in a particular stretch of water knows something real and valuable, but that knowledge may be expressed in terms of landmarks, seasonal ice patterns, and local place names that require interpretation before they can be used to direct a sonar survey. The search team understood this, and the effort to document and use this oral knowledge was treated seriously, rather than as a secondary source to be consulted only when the written record ran out. The sonar scanning component of the search focused on areas identified as probable based on the combined archival and oral historical research. Sonar is a powerful tool for finding objects on the seafloor, but it requires knowing roughly where to look. A ship-sized object on the bottom of the Beaufort Sea would produce a distinctive sonar return, a hard, angular shape against the relatively flat sediment of the sea floor, but only if the sonar is scanning the right area. The Beaufort Sea covers approximately 476,000 square kilometres. Even with a generous estimate of the Baychimo's probable drift range after 1969, the search area was still enormous, and the resources available for sonar scanning were finite. The team had to make choices about where to focus, and those choices were informed by everything the archival and oral historical research had produced. The search did not find the ship. No sonar return was identified as a confirmed match for the Baychimo. No debris field was located. No section of hull was detected in any of the areas surveyed. The result was, in the language of formal search outcomes, negative, which is a clinical way of saying that the ship remained as elusive in 2006 as it had been in every decade before. It is worth being clear about what a negative result does and does not mean in this context. It does not mean the ship was not there. It means the ship was not found in the areas that were searched, using the methods that were available. The distinction matters because the search was necessarily incomplete. The Beaufort Sea is deep in places and shallow in others, and the sonar coverage achieved in a bounded search effort is not the same as a comprehensive survey of the entire probable search area. There are portions of the seafloor in this region that have not been mapped at the resolution needed to identify a ship-sized object. There are areas where sediment accumulation or ice cover may have obscured a sonar return. A negative result in a search like this closes some possibilities, but does not close all of them. What the 2006 search did accomplish, beyond the practical effort to locate the ship, was to formally document the Baychimo story in a way that had not been done before. The archival research produced a consolidated record of the ship's known sightings and movements. The elder interviews preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost as the generation with direct memory of the ship's later drift years continued to age. The Alaska State Historic Preservation Office's involvement meant that the Baychimo was officially recognized as part of Alaska's maritime heritage, which has implications for how any future discovery would be handled. If the ship is ever found, if a sonar survey in some future year picks up a return that matches the Baychimo's dimensions, or if a remotely operated vehicle photographs a hull that can be identified by its construction details, there is now a framework in place for treating that discovery with the historical significance it deserves. There is also something worth noting about the timing of the 2006 effort, which came at a moment when Arctic conditions were beginning to change in ways that had implications for what might eventually be findable. The Arctic has been warming, and that warming has been affecting sea ice in significant ways. Ice that was permanent or semi-permanent for much of the 20th century has been retreating and thinning. Areas that were once inaccessible for much of the year are becoming navigable for longer periods. This is a complicated and in many ways troubling development, but one of its practical side effects is that the Arctic seafloor and coastline are becoming more accessible to survey and exploration than they have been historically. Ships and aircraft that could not reach certain areas in the 1970s or 1980s can now reach them more easily. Sonar technology has also improved dramatically since the 1960s and 1970s, when the last serious search efforts were made. If the Baychimo sank in a location that was previously inaccessible or difficult to survey, it is possible, not certain, but possible, that changing Arctic conditions will eventually bring that location within reach of a search effort. The 2006 resolution noted this possibility, at least implicitly, in its framing of the search as an ongoing effort rather than a one-time event. The language of the resolution acknowledged that finding the ship might require multiple attempts and continued attention over time as conditions and technology evolved. The elder interviews conducted as part of the 2006 search are worth dwelling on for a moment, because they represent a dimension of the Baychimo story that is easy to overlook when the focus is on sonar returns and archival coordinates. Several of the elders interviewed had family connections to people who had encountered the ship directly. One elder described knowledge passed down from a relative who had seen the Baychimo in the 1950s, not as a dramatic event but as a known feature of the landscape, something that was simply there, familiar and strange at the same time. Another elder recalled community discussions about the ship's movements in the 1960s, the way that sightings were shared and noted among hunters who travelled those waters regularly. The ship was not a mystery to these communities in the way that it was to outsiders. It was a presence, a known thing, something that had been part of the coastal world for so long that it had acquired a kind of normalcy, even in its strangeness. This is a different relationship to the Baychimo than the one recorded in newspaper headlines or Hudson's Bay Company documents. The formal record tends to treat each sighting as a discrete event, a surprising reappearance of a vessel that should not exist. The oral record, as captured in the 2006 interviews, suggests something more continuous. A ship that was woven into the navigational and experiential knowledge of people who spent their lives on those waters, tracked not as a curiosity, but as a feature of the environment that happened to move. There is something in that perspective that feels closer to the reality of the ship's existence than the dramatic language of ghost ships and maritime mysteries. The Baychimo was not haunting the Arctic in any supernatural sense. It was simply there, doing what the ice and the currents directed it to do, and the people who knew those waters best were the ones who kept track of it most consistently. The 2006 search also raised a question that had been present in the background of the Baychimo story for years, but had never been formally addressed. What would happen if the ship were found? The legal status of the Baychimo is genuinely complicated. The Hudson's Bay Company, which owned the vessel, officially abandoned it in 1931. Under maritime law, abandoned vessels can be claimed by whoever finds them, subject to various national and international regulations. But the Baychimo is not just any abandoned vessel. It is a documented piece of Alaska's maritime heritage, and it spent decades moving through waters that are subject to both American and Canadian jurisdiction, as well as waters that are recognised as traditional territories of indigenous communities. Any discovery of the ship would involve navigating a complex set of overlapping legal and cultural claims. The 2006 resolution addressed this, in part by establishing the Alaska State Historic Preservation Office as the relevant authority for managing any future discovery. But the full legal picture would depend on where the ship was found and in what condition. There is also the question of what a discovery would actually look like. If the Baychimo sank in deep water, what remains of it after 50 or 60 years on the seafloor of the Beaufort Sea might be difficult to identify with certainty. Steel corrodes, wood rots, structures collapse under their own weight as the metal weakens. A ship that has been on the seafloor for decades in cold salt water may retain its basic shape, or it may have collapsed into a debris field that is harder to recognise as a vessel. The 1914 construction of the Baychimo used materials and techniques that are different from modern shipbuilding, which means that identifying the wreck would require knowledge of what those early 20th century cargo ships looked like structurally. The specific configuration of the hull, the dimensions of the machinery spaces, the placement of the masts and fittings. The people who conducted the 2006 search were aware of this, and part of the archival research involved collecting whatever technical documentation existed about the ship's construction, so that any future sonar or visual contact could be evaluated against a known profile. None of this resolved the central question. The Baychimo was not found in 2006, and it has not been found since. The search demonstrated that finding the ship is a serious undertaking that requires significant resources and careful methodology, and that even with those resources and that methodology, success is not guaranteed. It also demonstrated that the interest in finding the ship is real and ongoing, not just among historians and maritime enthusiasts, but among the Alaska Native communities whose ancestors encountered the vessel, and among the institutions responsible for preserving Alaska's cultural heritage. The story that the 2006 effort tells, in a way, is the same story the Baychimo itself told across 38 years of drifting. The ship resisted being claimed, it resisted being found, It moved on its own terms in its own time through a landscape that did not make things easy for anyone trying to follow it. And even now, decades after the last confirmed sighting, it continues to resist resolution. The search goes on, in the sense that the question remains open. The ship is out there somewhere, in whatever form it now takes, and the people who care about finding it have not stopped caring. The mystery did not end with the 2006 resolution. If anything, the formal search gave the question a kind of renewed legitimacy, a recognition that the Baychimo deserves a real answer, not just a comfortable assumption that it must have sunk somewhere and that is that. And so the question passes forward into whatever search effort comes next, into whatever technology becomes available, into whatever changing Arctic conditions eventually reveal. The Baychimo spent decades being part of the living world of the Arctic, encountered by hunters and trappers and pilots and salvagers across nearly 4 decades. That it has continued to be part of the story, still searched for, still discussed, still officially unresolved, suggests that the ship's hold on the imagination is not merely nostalgic, it is connected to something genuine. The fact that we do not know, and not knowing, in this case, is not a failure. It is simply the condition the Baychimo has always imposed on everyone who tried to pin it down, which brings us naturally to the question of how this ship fits into the broader history of vessels lost in the Arctic, and why, when you place it alongside the others, its story turns out to be stranger than almost any of them. The Arctic has swallowed a great many ships. That is simply a fact of the place, a consequence of what happens when human ambition and wooden or steel hulls meet moving ice in a sea that does not particularly care about either. The list of vessels lost in Arctic waters across the 19th and 20th centuries is long, and most of those losses share a common shape. A ship enters the ice wins, and the ship goes down or is crushed beyond use within a season or two. That is the normal arc. The Baychimo does not follow it, and the way to understand just how unusual the Baychimo's story is to place it alongside some of the other ships that tried to survive in those same waters, and to see how quickly most of them were gone. The most famous Arctic maritime disaster in history is probably the Franklin expedition, and the ships at the centre of it were the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror. These were not ordinary vessels. They had been specially reinforced for Arctic conditions, fitted with steam engines to supplement their sails, and equipped with provisions for years of operation. The expedition set out in 1845 under the command of Sir John Franklin, with the goal of navigating the Northwest Passage, the long-sought sea route through the Canadian Arctic archipelago. The Erebus and the Terror became trapped in the ice near King William Island in September 1846. They never moved again under their own power. The crew abandoned the ships in April 1848, after Franklin and a number of other men had already died, and the remaining crew attempted to walk south to safety. None of them survived. The Erebus was located on the seafloor in 2014, and the Terror was found in 2016, both remarkably well preserved by the cold. But they had been sitting on the bottom for roughly 168 years by the time they were found. From the moment they were abandoned to the moment they sank, which was probably within a year or two of the crew leaving, the ships were gone. The ice that trapped them eventually destroyed them. The total time the Erebus and Terror survived in Arctic waters after being abandoned was almost certainly less than 2 years. The Karluk is another example worth sitting with. The Karluk was a brigantine, a small sailing vessel, that served as the flagship of the Canadian Arctic expedition of 1913, under the command of Vilhjálmur Stephensen. In August of that year, the ship became trapped in the ice in the Chukchi Sea, not far from the waters the Baychimo would later drift through. Stephensen left the ship to go on what he described as a hunting trip and never returned, leaving the crew behind. The Karluk drifted westward through the ice for months, carrying its crew helplessly along with it. In January 1914, the ice pressure finally became too much, and the Karluk sank in a matter of hours. The crew, led by Captain Robert Bartlett, survived by making their way across the ice to Wrangel Island, from which most of them were eventually rescued. The Karluk lasted roughly 5 months from the time it became trapped to the time it went under. 5 months. The Baychimo lasted 38 years. The Jeannette offers yet another comparison. The USS Jeannette was an American naval vessel that set out in 1879 under Lieutenant Commander George DeLong, attempting to reach the North Pole by sailing through the Bering Strait. The ship became trapped in the ice north of Siberia in September 1879 and drifted for nearly 2 years before the ice pressure finally crushed it in June 1881. The Jeannette lasted longer than the Karluk, almost 2 years of being locked in the ice, but the outcome was the same. The ice eventually won, the ship went down. DeLong and most of his crew did not survive the subsequent attempt to reach land across the ice. So when you line these ships up against the Baychimo, the contrast becomes genuinely striking. The Erebus and Terror, gone within roughly 2 years of entrapment, probably less. The Karluk, 5 months. The Jeannette, about 21 months. These were all purpose-built or specially reinforced vessels, some of them carrying experienced crews who tried actively to preserve them. The Baychimo was a working cargo ship, not particularly special in its construction, left entirely unmanned, and it drifted for 38 years. The numbers just do not compute in the way you would expect them to. Part of the explanation, as discussed earlier in this story, has to do with the specific behaviour of ice in the Beaufort and Chukchi seas, the circular drift patterns, the way pack ice in this particular region can carry a vessel, rather than simply crush it. But it is worth noting that the Karluk and the Jeannette were also in these waters, or waters very close to them, and they did not survive. The Baychimo's position and the specific conditions of its abandonment seem to have placed it in a drift pattern that was unusually protective. Whether that was luck, geography, or some combination of both is difficult to say with any precision. There is also the question of the ship's condition at the time of abandonment. The Baychimo was abandoned in November 1931, at the beginning of the Arctic winter, after its cargo had been removed. An empty hull sits higher in the water than a loaded one, which changes how ice interacts with it. A fully loaded ship presents more of its hull to lateral ice pressure, while a lighter vessel may ride differently. Not necessarily safer, but differently. Some maritime historians have suggested that the Baychimo's relatively light draft after the cargo was removed may have allowed it to be lifted and carried by ice rather than squeezed by it. This is speculative, but it is a reasonable physical argument. The ships that were crushed, the Karluk, the Jeannette, were carrying full loads and full crews with all the weight that implied. There is another dimension to the comparison that is easy to overlook, and it has to do with the kind of ship the Baychimo was. The Franklin expedition ships, the Karluk, the Jeannette, these were all vessels engaged in exploration. They were famous in their time, crewed by men whose names were known, carrying missions that attracted public attention. When they were lost, the losses were reported as disasters, as tragedies, as failures of ambition against the power of the Arctic. The Baychimo was none of those things. It was a cargo ship. It hauled fox pelts and trade goods along a commercial route. Its crew were working sailors, not explorers or naval officers. Its captain, John Cornwell, was a practical man doing a practical job. When the ship was abandoned, the Hudson's Bay Company's primary concern was recovering the cargo, which they did, and then moving on. The Baychimo was not a famous ship when it was lost. It became famous afterward because of what happened next. That distinction matters more than it might seem. The ghost ship mythology that grew up around the Baychimo was not built on a foundation of heroic exploration or national tragedy. It was built on something quieter and stranger, a working vessel that simply refused to go away. Most ghost ship legends involve dramatic disasters. Ships found drifting with their crews mysteriously vanished, or vessels wrecked in storms and then supposedly seen again by superstitious sailors. The Baychimo story has none of that. There was no mystery about what happened to the crew. They were airlifted out, or they walked away, or they made deliberate decisions to leave. The ship was not haunted in any narrative sense. It was just empty and floating and present, and that, in some ways, is a stranger kind of story than the dramatic ones. The exploration ships that were lost in the Arctic became part of a narrative about human ambition and the limits of what people could achieve in extreme environments. They were lost in the pursuit of something, a passage, a pole, a geographic prize. Their losses had meaning within the framework of exploration history. The Baychimo's survival has a different quality. It was not surviving in pursuit of anything. It had no purpose after its abandonment, no mission, no crew with intentions. It was just a steel hull in a cold sea doing what physics and geography directed it to do. And the fact that physics and geography directed it to keep floating for nearly 4 decades, while purpose-built exploration vessels sank within months or years, gives the Baychimo's story a kind of quiet irony that is hard to shake. It is also worth noting that the Baychimo's survival was not uninterrupted. The ship was not seen every year. There were gaps of several years between some sightings, and during those gaps no one knew for certain that it was still afloat. Each new sighting was in some sense a small surprise. The ship had survived another winter, another summer, another cycle of freeze and thaw. The people who encountered it were not expecting it to still be there. That quality of unexpected persistence, repeated across nearly 4 decades, is what separates the Baychimo from ships that were lost quickly and ships that were carefully preserved. It occupied a strange middle category, not saved, not destroyed, just continuing. The specific geography of the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas deserves a moment of attention here, because it is genuinely central to understanding why the Baychimo could do what it did. These are relatively shallow seas compared to the deep ocean basins of the Pacific or Atlantic. The Beaufort Sea averages a depth of around 1 kilometre, but large portions of its continental shelf are much shallower, in some areas less than 50 metres deep. The pack ice that covers these seas follows circulation patterns driven by wind and the Beaufort Gyre, a large clockwise rotation of water and ice in the western Arctic. A vessel caught in the gyre can be carried in large, slow loops, rather than being driven steadily toward a coastline or into deeper water. This is different from the conditions in the Canadian Arctic archipelago, where the Franklin ships were lost in much more confined channels where ice pressure was relentless and directional. The open Beaufort and Chukchi Seas gave the Baychimo room to move, and the gyre may have kept it in a circuit that, by chance, avoided the most dangerous pressure zones. None of the other ships in this comparison had that particular combination of factors working in their favour. The Karluk was in the Chukchi Sea, which overlaps with the Baychimo's territory, but it was caught in a different season and in different ice conditions, and it was carrying a full crew whose weight and activities may have affected how the ice interacted with the hull. The Jeannette was further north, in waters where the drift patterns are different, and the ice is generally older and more compacted. The Franklin ships were in narrow channels where there was simply no room to be carried safely. The Baychimo happened to be in the right place, at the right season, in the right condition, to be caught by a drift pattern that kept it going rather than destroying it. That is not a romantic explanation. It does not make the Baychimo's story into something mystical or predetermined, but it does make it genuinely unusual in the context of Arctic maritime history. The ship was not special. The conditions in this particular case were, and the combination produced something that no one planned, no one expected, and no one has fully been able to replicate or explain in terms of a precise mechanical account. The Baychimo drifted for 38 years because of a specific convergence of factors that came together once, in one ship's history, and has not been documented in the same way for any other vessel before or since. What makes the comparison to the exploration ships particularly interesting is also what makes the Baychimo's legend feel different in tone. The Franklin expedition is a story about tragedy, about the cost of ambition, about what happens when the Arctic refuses to yield to human will. The Karluk is a story about survival and leadership under impossible conditions. The Jeanette is a story about endurance and failure. The Baychimo is a story about something harder to name, about persistence without intention, about a thing that keeps going not because anyone willed it to, but simply because the conditions allowed it. There is something almost peaceful about that if you think about it long enough. The ship was not struggling. It was not suffering. It was just there, moving with the ice season after season, in a landscape that had no particular interest in whether it stayed or went. And perhaps that is why the story has stayed with people the way it has. The dramatic losses, the Franklin ships, the Karluk, are remembered as disasters. The Baychimo is remembered as something closer to a presence, a ship that became part of the Arctic in a way that no one intended, that was woven into the experience of the people who lived and worked in those waters, that showed up in the accounts of hunters and trappers and pilots across nearly 4 decades. It was not a ghost in the supernatural sense, but it was something, a persistent, quiet, moving thing in a landscape of ice and water, outlasting the famous ships and the forgotten ones alike, without any particular reason to still be there, and yet there nonetheless. Which brings us, in the most natural way, back to the people. Because the Baychimo's story was never really just about the ship. It was about every person who encountered it, every brief and strange meeting between a human being and an empty vessel drifting alone in the cold. And those encounters, taken together, tell a story that no official record quite captures on its own. Think about the kinds of people who moved through a place like the Western Arctic in the first half of the 20th century. They are not, for the most part, people who write memoirs. They are hunters, trappers, traders, and pilots who fly small planes over ice fields and do not always keep detailed logs of what they see below. They are members of communities whose knowledge travels by word of mouth rather than through newspaper columns or government archives. The Baychimo passed through the lives of these people, briefly, strangely, memorably, and most of what they experienced was never written down in any formal sense. What survives is fragmentary. A report here, a second-hand account there, a name attached to a sighting in a company record or a local newspaper story. But taken together, even in their incompleteness, these fragments form something real. They form a picture of a ship that was genuinely known, not as an abstraction, not as a maritime curiosity read about in a southern city newspaper, but as an actual presence in the actual landscape where people actually lived and worked. The earliest of these encounters, in the winter of 1932, is in some ways the most quietly remarkable. A group of Inuit hunters came across the Baychimo drifting in the ice, months after it had been abandoned, and they did what made complete practical sense in that environment. They went aboard and used it as shelter. This was not a dramatic moment of discovery. It was not a salvage operation or an attempt to claim the vessel. It was simply people in a cold place finding a structure that could keep them out of the wind and using it. The ship, from their perspective, was a resource. Unexpected, unusual but useful. They spent time aboard, waited out the conditions, and then continued on their way. What they thought of the ship, what they said to each other about it, what it meant to find an empty vessel sitting in the ice with no explanation, those things are not recorded. But the encounter happened, and it was the first of many times that the Baychimo would serve as an impromptu refuge for people caught in the Arctic's indifferent weather. Leslie Melvin came the following year, in 1933. He was a trapper, working the kind of solitary extended routes that trappers in the Western Arctic travelled during those decades. When he found the Baychimo, he did not just note it from a distance. He went aboard and spent time there. What he found was a ship that was still recognisably a ship. The hull was intact enough to be on the surface. The interior was cold and empty and deteriorating, but it had structure. He could move through it, examine it, understand what it had been. Melvin's account, such as it is, describes a vessel that felt suspended, not wrecked, not abandoned in the way a thing is abandoned when it has been thrown away, but more like something that had been set down carefully and not yet picked back up. That quality of suspension, of a ship that seemed to be waiting rather than decaying, appears in several of the accounts from this period. It is worth noting that by 1933 the Baychimo had already survived 2 full Arctic winters without a crew. The fact that Melvin could board it and move around inside it says something real about the ship's condition. It was not a wreck. Not yet. It was still, in some functional sense, a ship. The 1934 sighting near Herschel Island brought a different kind of witness. Prospectors, men moving through the Arctic in search of mineral deposits, spotted the Baychimo from a distance. Their encounter was less intimate than Melvin's. They saw the ship rather than boarding it, but the sighting added another data point to a pattern that was becoming hard to dismiss. The Baychimo was not staying in one place. It was not caught in a fixed location where someone might eventually come to retrieve it. It was moving, appearing in different parts of the Western Arctic, and the people who saw it were spread across a wide geography. Herschel Island is in the Yukon, near the border with Alaska. Point Barrow is further west along the Alaskan coast. The ship was covering ground, or rather the ice was covering ground and carrying the ship with it, and the people who lived and worked in these waters were encountering it at different points along its involuntary route. What is interesting about the prospector's sighting is that by 1934, the Baychimo already had enough of a reputation that seeing it was not entirely bewildering. Word had spread through Arctic communities and among the various trappers, traders and travellers who moved through the region. People knew there was an abandoned ship out there. They knew it kept being found. So when someone spotted it, there was a frame for understanding what they were looking at. Not a hallucination, not a mystery ship from nowhere, but the Baychimo, the Hudson's Bay Company vessel that had been drifting since 1931. The ship had, in a relatively short time, become a known quantity in a landscape where known quantities were valuable. In the Arctic, information about what is out there, where the ice is thick, where the currents run, what landmarks are visible, travels between people carefully and practically. The Baychimo became part of that information network. People knew to look for it, knew roughly what waters it favoured, knew what it looked like from a distance. This practical, community-level knowledge is one of the things that official records tend to underrepresent. The Hudson's Bay Company had its reports. Newspapers had their occasional stories. But the ongoing, living awareness of the Baychimo among Alaska Native and Inuit communities was something different, a kind of distributed knowledge that accumulated over decades and was passed between people, through conversation rather than documentation. Elders who were young in the 1930s and 1940s would later recall hearing about the ship, or seeing it themselves, or knowing someone who had sheltered in it during a storm. This oral record is fragmentary and difficult to verify in the way that written records can be verified, but it is also, in some respects, more continuous than the written record. The written sightings have gaps, years where no report was filed, where the Baychimo simply drifted without being observed by anyone who left a document behind. The oral tradition suggests that the ship was noticed more often than the official record shows, that it passed through the awareness of communities along the Alaskan and Canadian Arctic coast in ways that were not always formalised into reports. The pilots add another layer to this picture. As aviation expanded in Alaska through the 1930s and 1940s, more people were flying over Arctic waters, and some of them spotted the Baychimo from the air. An aerial sighting of a drifting ship is a particular kind of experience. You see the whole shape of it at once, the hull against the ice, the absence of any smoke or wake or sign of life. From above, a ship at sea normally has context, other ships nearby, a port in the distance, the visible evidence of its purpose and destination. The Baychimo, seen from the air, had none of that. It was just a shape on the ice, alone, in a place where nothing should be alone in quite that way. Several pilots reported the sighting and noted the ship's position, which helped researchers and searchers later piece together something of its drift trajectory. These aerial observations were practical in one sense. They confirmed the ship's location and condition from a distance, but they also contributed to the growing sense of the Baychimo as something genuinely strange. A ship you can see, but cannot quite reach. A vessel that is there when you look down, and gone by the time anyone could get to it. The 1956 boarding is the most detailed account from the ship's later years, and it deserves some attention. The group that went aboard that year spent several days on the Baychimo, which gave them time to examine it in a way that the briefer encounters had not allowed. By 1956, the ship had been drifting for 25 years. What they found was a vessel that was visibly aging but still afloat. The hull, though corroded and marked by decades of ice contact, had not failed in any catastrophic way. The interior was in poor condition, wood rotting, metal rusting, the spaces that had once held cargo and crew now empty and cold and dark. But the basic structure was there. The ship was recognisable. You could still understand, standing inside it, what it had been built for, what kind of life it had once supported. That recognition of a thing that has outlasted its purpose but not its form seems to have made a strong impression on the people who were there. Their accounts describe the ship with a kind of quiet attention, a care in observation that suggests they understood they were seeing something unusual, not supernatural but genuinely rare. A ship 25 years unmanned, still floating, still whole enough to walk through. What they could not have known, standing on the deck in 1956, was that the Baychimo would continue drifting for another 13 years after their visit, that the last confirmed sighting was still more than a decade away. In some ways, knowing that now makes the 1956 encounter feel more poignant than it perhaps felt to the people who were there. They were not witnessing the end of the ship's story. They were somewhere in the middle of it, with no way to know how much further it would go. The stories that spread from encounters like these, the 1932 sheltering, the 1933 visit, the 1956 boarding, travelled through Arctic communities and eventually into the wider world. But the way they travelled through Arctic communities was different from the way they appeared in southern newspapers. In a newspaper, the Baychimo was a curiosity, a ghost ship story with a satisfying strangeness to it. In Arctic communities, the ship was something more integrated into the texture of daily life and practical knowledge. People who worked on the ice or along the coast knew the Baychimo as part of the landscape they navigated. Unpredictable, occasionally useful, always a little uncanny but real. It was not folklore in the sense of something embellished or mythologized beyond recognition. It was more like a well-known local fact that happened to be stranger than most local facts. There is something worth sitting with in the variety of people who encountered this ship. An Inuit hunter seeking shelter from a storm, a trapper on a long winter route, a group of prospectors scanning the horizon, a pilot looking down from a small aircraft, a salvage crew trying and failing to bring it in. Each of these people came to the Baychimo from a completely different direction. Different purposes, different backgrounds, different relationships to the Arctic, and each of them left with the same basic experience. They had found something that should not still be there, and then they had left it behind, and it had kept going without them. The ship did not need any of them. It was not waiting for rescue. It was simply present, in the way that ice and water and cold are present, indifferent to human intention, continuing on its own terms. That quality of indifference is part of what makes the human encounters with the Baychimo feel the way they do. The people who found the ship brought their own meanings to it. Shelter, curiosity, a story to tell, a salvage opportunity, a navigational reference point. The ship offered none of those meanings on its own. It was just a hull in the ice. But the fact that it kept being there, kept being found by different people in different years, gave it an accumulated significance that no single encounter could have produced. The Baychimo's second life was made up of these brief, scattered moments of human contact, each one small on its own, but together forming something that persisted in memory the way the ship itself persisted in the water. And the memory, like the ship, has proven surprisingly durable. The people who sheltered aboard it in 1932 are long gone. Leslie Melvin is gone. The prospectors, the pilots, the salvagers, the 1956 boarding party, all of them gone. But the accounts they left behind, fragmentary and imperfect as they are, have kept the Baychimo present in a way that goes beyond what any single document could achieve. The oral histories held by Arctic communities, the company records, the newspaper stories, the government resolution passed in Alaska in 2006, all of it together forms a kind of archive of a ship that was never supposed to last this long, remembered by people who were never supposed to have so much to say about it. What is perhaps most striking, when you look at the full span of these encounters, is how ordinary most of them were in their immediate context. People found a ship, they used it or observed it or tried to claim it, and then they moved on. The strangeness came later, in the accumulation. No single encounter with the Baychimo was, by itself, an extraordinary event. It was the repetition, the same ship, different people, different years, different places, that produced the legend, and that repetition was not planned or orchestrated. It was just what happened when a particular vessel drifted through a particular landscape for a very long time, crossing paths with the human lives that move through that same landscape in their own ways. The Baychimo's story at this level is less about a ghost ship than it is about a geography and the people who know it. The western Arctic coast, the Beaufort and Chukchi seas, the communities at Barrow and Herschel Island and along the Alaskan shore. These are places with their own histories, their own knowledge systems, their own ways of relating to the environment. The Baychimo drifted through all of that, was absorbed into all of that, and left traces in all of that. The ship is gone now, almost certainly, but the traces remain, in the form of accounts and memories and a story that has continued to be told long after the vessel itself disappeared. And the question of where it went, of what finally happened to it, and whether any part of it still exists somewhere in the cold water or ice of the Beaufort Sea, is a question that remains even now genuinely open. So what does the Baychimo leave behind exactly? Not wreckage. None has ever been confirmed. Not a grave marker. Not a final resting place with coordinates anyone can point to on a chart. What it leaves behind is something hard to categorise. A story, yes, a long and strange one, but also a kind of proof, quiet and unintentional, that the world does not always resolve itself the way we expect it to. Things do not always sink when they are supposed to. Things do not always disappear on schedule. There is something almost comforting in that, if you let yourself sit with it for a moment. The Baychimo was a working cargo ship. It was not built to be remarkable. It was built to carry fox pelts and trade goods through difficult water, to make the same run year after year, to be useful and then eventually to wear out and be replaced. That was the whole plan. And then the plan changed, in a blizzard near Point Barrow in November of 1931, and the ship became something else entirely, something that nobody planned for, and nobody quite knew how to account for. For 38 years after that it drifted, and now, more than half a century after the last confirmed sighting, it is still being talked about. That is not nothing. The Beaufort Sea, where the Baychimo was last seen in 1969, is a vast and largely uncharted body of water in any practical sense. Sonar surveys have covered portions of it, but the seafloor in that region is not mapped with anything close to the resolution you would need to confidently say a particular ship is or is not down there. The 2006 search commissioned by the Alaska legislature was a genuine effort. Real archival work, real interviews with Alaska native elders, real sonar passes over areas where the ship was historically known to drift. And it found nothing conclusive, which does not mean the ship is not there. It means the search did not find it. Those are different things, in a place that large and that cold, and that deep in places and that shallow in others. The Beaufort Sea ranges from relatively shallow coastal shelves, in some areas less than 50 metres deep, to deeper offshore basins. If the Baychimo grounded on a shallow shoal somewhere along the Alaskan or Canadian coastline, it could theoretically still be there in some form, resting on the bottom in water shallow enough that it might even be visible from the surface in the right conditions. If it sank in deeper water, it is likely sitting on the seafloor in a state of gradual collapse, the steel corroding slowly in the cold, the structure settling into the sediment over decades. Cold water slows corrosion considerably. Ships have been found on Arctic and subarctic seafloors in surprisingly recognisable condition after many years. The Baychimo, if it sank sometime in the 1970s or later, could still be largely intact down there. And then there is the possibility, unlikely but not impossible, that it is still locked in ice somewhere. The Western Arctic has regions where multi-year ice that does not fully melt in summer, persists for long stretches. A vessel caught in that kind of ice and pushed into a remote enough area could theoretically remain there for a very long time, invisible to satellite imagery that cannot penetrate thick pack ice, unreachable by any practical search effort. It is a remote possibility. But the Baychimo had already demonstrated a remarkable talent for being in places that made it hard to find. The honest answer is that nobody knows. And there is something in that honest answer that feels strangely appropriate to this particular story. The Baychimo spent 38 years being unpredictable, appearing and disappearing, resisting every attempt to pin it down. It would be almost out of character for it to have a neat, documented ending. The ship that evaded salvage crews and outlasted its own obituaries and kept turning up in the wrong places at the wrong times. It makes a kind of sense that its final chapter would be unwritten, not dramatic, not confirmed, just quietly unresolved, somewhere out there in the cold. What the Baychimo represents, when you step back from the individual facts of it, is a certain kind of endurance that the Arctic both enables and destroys in equal measure. The same environment that makes survival possible for a drifting hull, the cold that slows decay, the ice that can cradle and protect, is also the environment that has swallowed entire expeditions, crushed ships in hours, and kept the seafloor hidden beneath layers of ice and darkness for centuries. The Arctic is not kind. It is not cruel either. It is indifferent in a way that is genuinely hard for most people to fully imagine, because most of us live in places where the environment responds to human activity in some recognisable way. The Arctic does not respond. It simply continues, on its own enormous timescale, doing what it does. The Baychimo drifted through that indifference for nearly 4 decades. It was not preserved by any particular care or intention. It was preserved by a combination of its own construction, the specific dynamics of the ice it drifted in, the cold that slowed the processes that would have destroyed it faster in warmer water, and, honestly, a considerable amount of luck. The ship was in the right ice at the right time repeatedly, in a way that no one could have predicted or engineered. It just happened, and then it kept happening year after year until it stopped. There is a temptation when telling a story like this to reach for a grand meaning, to say the Baychimo teaches us something about persistence, or about the smallness of human plans against the scale of the natural world, or about the way certain things refuse to be forgotten. And maybe all of those things are true in some loose sense, but the Baychimo is also just a ship. A steel-hulled cargo vessel built in Hamburg in 1914 that had a strange and improbable second life in the Arctic, and that eventually disappeared in a way that nobody witnessed and nobody can fully explain. The meaning, if there is meaning in it, is probably not something that can be stated cleanly. It is more like the feeling you get from the story itself, a kind of quiet astonishment that the world contains things like this, that something so ordinary could become so strange, that the ice could hold something for so long and then let it go and leave no trace. The people who encountered the Baychimo across those 38 years, the hunters who sheltered inside it, the trappers who walked its decks, the salvagers who watched it drift away from them again, none of them were looking for a symbol. They were just living their lives in a difficult place, and a ship kept appearing in their world. The meaning the ship has accumulated over time was not something they put there. It grew around the story afterward, the way ice grows around a hull slowly and without intention, and the communities that knew the Baychimo best, the Alaska Native and Inuit communities along the western Arctic coast, knew it not as a legend but as a fact of their landscape. A well-known, somewhat uncanny fact, but a fact. The ship was part of the geography they navigated, part of the knowledge they held about their own territory. That knowledge was passed down in the form of stories and practical information, the same way knowledge about ice conditions and hunting grounds and seasonal patterns was passed down. The Baychimo was absorbed into that body of knowledge because it was genuinely there, genuinely part of the environment for a very long time. That is a different kind of legacy than the one it has in southern newspapers or maritime history books. It is more personal, more embedded in actual lived experience, and in some ways more durable. The 2006 Alaska legislative resolution is, in its own way, a small acknowledgement of that legacy. A state government deciding that a ship abandoned in 1931 was still worth searching for in 2006. That is not nothing either. It reflects the fact that the Baychimo had become genuinely significant to people in Alaska, not just as a curiosity, but as part of a shared history that deserved to be taken seriously. The search did not find the ship, but the fact that it happened at all says something about how deeply the Baychimo had embedded itself in the consciousness of the region. Somewhere in the Beaufort Sea, or possibly along a remote stretch of coastline, or possibly locked in ice that no one has looked beneath, there may be a hull. Rusted, collapsed, pressed into sediment or ice. Unrecognisable in some ways and possibly still recognisable in others. The cold is a good preservationist in its way. Ships found on Arctic seafloors have surprised researchers with how much of their structure remained after many decades. If the Baychimo is down there, it may not look like nothing. It may look, at least in outline, like a ship, but no one has found it. And until someone does, if someone ever does, the Baychimo remains in that strange category of things that are almost certainly gone, but not confirmed gone. It is a category that the Arctic has more entries in than almost anywhere else on Earth. The Franklin Expedition's ship spent 168 years in that category before HMS Erebus was found in 2014 and HMS Terror in 2016. The Jeanette, the Carluck, the dozens of smaller vessels that went into the ice and did not come back. The Arctic has always been a place where things disappear without a final answer. The Baychimo is in good company in that sense. Strange company, but good. What stays with you at the end of this story is probably not any single fact. It is more the cumulative texture of it. A ship built in Hamburg sailing fur routes in the Western Arctic, trapped by ice in a November storm, drifting away in the night, found again and again by people who had no reason to expect it, outlasting every attempt to claim it, lasting long enough to become part of the living memory of an entire region, and then quietly, without ceremony, becoming absent. The story does not have an ending so much as it has a last confirmed moment. 1969, the Beaufort Sea, Inuit hunters, the ship still there, and then silence. The Arctic kept its secret after that. It is very good at that. The ice closes over things, the water is dark and cold and deep in places and shallow in others, and the seasons turn without much regard for what human beings are trying to find or understand. The Baychimo drifted into all of that, and the ice closed around it, and that was the last anyone reliably saw of it. Thank you for spending this time with the story of the SS Baychimo. It is one of those stories that lingers a little, I think. Not because it is dramatic in the conventional sense, but because it is so genuinely strange and so genuinely real. If there is a part of it that stayed with you, or a question it left you with, I would love to hear about it in the comments. And if you are new here, and this is the kind of storytelling you enjoy, please do consider subscribing. There are many more stories like this one waiting, from places just as remote and just as quietly extraordinary as the Western Arctic. Wherever you are tonight, whatever the temperature is outside your window, I hope you are warm and comfortable, and I hope the rest of your night is peaceful. Good night.